we're having some technical problems, so as soon as the technical problems have been eliminated or corrected, then we'll get the
Can you hear what I'm saying? I know you're all riveted by my eruditeness, but I thought I would just make sure you all could hear what I was saying. How's that working?
again, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties, and we will begin as soon as they are eliminated. We're experiencing.
So we have to press the button. Got it.
Probably blissful thinking that that we're not there in August, but it's very possibly we will be, I guess.
Right, thanks. Thank you.
When is the, is Greg still there yet?
Justin,
Greg,
can you hear me?
when is the Republican convention, national convention?
Good.
No, that's
Okay.
a question. I don't know.
One in Charlotte?
Yeah,
Yeah.
where it is, I don't even know. When is that? Isn't that in July?
No, it's
No,
August.
I think they're.
It's the third week of August, I think.
Oh, so, and what about the Democratic one? Is that in July?
I think it's
No,
after
they're both-
ours. I think it's
Oh,
the
so
fourth week.
neither one is, both of them have been postponed till August.
That's right.
I was hoping maybe one was the first week at August.
Republicans are in Jacksonville, not Charlotte, right?
You're right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think I'm going to Jacksonville.
I think that
I
was a
think-
little up in the air too.
I think Morgan is still trying to get on. Sounds like. We got Fred and CMR on. Morgan Griffith's still in the holding cell.
Flores is on.
Hey, Bill.
How you all doing?
What's going on in the great state of Vermont, Mr. Welch?
Well, it's raining
Really?
right now, but we're going to get a heat wave. We're going to be under the heat dome. But we're moving from strawberries to blueberries and soon to corn.
We were
So,
talking about corn before.
delicious summer vegetables. And
I
all
know.
with maple syrup.
It's going to get up to 75 here, Peter, in San Diego. Be 75.
Well, it's rough. It's rough.
All
Yeah,
of,
but a heat wave in Vermont is 83.
So the
no,
whole
they
country
get
is
hot in
gonna be
Vermont.
safe. Isn't the whole country going to be really hot this week? Not
I know
just
that
Pittsburgh.
Vermont gets hot in summer. though.
We're going to have the telecom subcommittee in that ice bath that Doyle is.
Testing, testing,
That's right.
testing,
We'll just throw another
testing.
bag of ice in a hot tub, Peter. No problem.
1, 2, 3.
There's Fred.
Yeah.
What's that painting behind you, Fred? That looks like a lighthouse in Michigan.
It is. It's from my old district when I used to have Grand Haven. It's a great picture, a watercolor of the Grand Haven Lighthouse now in Bill Heisinger's district. They gave it to me when the Coast Guard Festival.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Secretary, we are experiencing some issues with our WellMax. It was working a few moments ago, but all of a sudden it decided it did not want to cooperate, so it'll be just a few more moments. That's fine. All right.
Yeah, we got all this stuff down, Pat, huh?
I know. What are you gonna do?
30 bills anymore, 35 bills. Good Lord.
Don't worry, we'll get. It's gonna be bipartisan. We'll probably get done by the end of the day.
Let's assume people don't talk all day, Frank. You know, a lot of these guys like to talk a lot, so.
I found it.
You're gonna be, we ought to let Mike run the timer. And
Yeah, can I be the time control timer?
5 minutes. So.
Come to order. Apologize for the technical delay. WellMax, Mr. wasn't cooperating with our
There we go.
technicians this morning. So the committee will now come to order. Today, the subcommittee is holding a hearing entitled Oversight of DOE during the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, members will be participating in today's hearing finally either in person or remotely via video conferencing. And just as a reminder, we've had some technical difficulties in making sure that our remote video was operating up to standard. As part of this hearing, the microphones of members participating remotely will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members participating remotely will need to unmute their microphones each time you wish to speak. For members and witnesses participating in person, I encourage you to wear your mask whenever you are not speaking. Dr. Monahan, the House physician, stressed in the updated attending physician COVID-19 guidelines that the use of face coverings is meant to protect other people in case the wearer is unknowingly infected but does not have symptoms. By wearing our mask when we are not speaking, each of us is playing a vital role in protecting all members and all staff who are in attendance as well as the leaders of the administration's COVID-19 response, who will be testifying before the committee today, the Secretary of Energy, Secretary Brouillette. Finally, documents for the record can be sent to Adam Fisher at the email address that we provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. Good afternoon. The recent decline in our nation's economic activity has resulted in a multitude of hardships within our communities and economic sectors. Today, the Subcommittee on Energy convenes for a hearing to further examine the impacts of novel coronavirus on a vital segment of our economy. From the outset, the pandemic has presented the energy sector with numerous challenges ranging from staggering unemployment rates, supply chain disruptions, declining demand, and depleted investment. At present, 1.3 million members of the energy sector workforce remain unemployed. A significant percentage of these jobs were once occupied by people of color and hardworking members of the clean energy industry, which previously enjoyed steady growth. Taking this into account, the subcommittee held a remote hearing in June to discuss the sector's recent setbacks. Throughout this hearing, we received expert testimony from witnesses who spoke to the pandemic's effect on clean energy jobs, as well as the industry's function as an economic recovery engine. In response to this hearing, I was proud to join my colleagues in including provisions to support workforce development, diversity, and clean energy infrastructure investment within the recent infrastructure bill. This committee, through its broad and envious jurisdiction, has oversight of federal agency resources that are key to the confrontation of the public health crisis and the economic challenges that are linked to the coronavirus. The Department of Energy and its vast enterprise is chief among these resources. That is why I am so pleased to welcome the Secretary of Energy, Secretary Dan Brouillette, who will testify before the subcommittee today. Secretary Brouillette is not a stranger to this subcommittee in that he served previously as the staff director to Chairman Tozan a few years back. To date, the Department of Energy has leveraged its national laboratory system, which includes Chicago's own Argonne National Lab, to harness its supercomputing capabilities to fight COVID-19. Additionally, it has worked to support the public and private sectors in keeping our very own lights on. However, the full deployment of DOE's resources is of great and vital importance to our nation's economic recovery. Existing program offices like the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity and the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy have the ability to drive employment opportunities, enhance sector diversity, and secure energy savings, especially at a time when they are so critically needed most. Therefore, I look forward to today's hearing as a first step in ensuring a productive partnership to preserve reliability and opportunity within the energy sector. With that, I yield to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Michigan, the ranking member, Fred Upton, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back to you, and welcome back, Mr. Secretary. You know, it's good to have you before the committee today, and certainly good to see you're thriving after your promotion to Cabinet Secretary. We've all said from the beginning, fortunate to have somebody like you at the helm at the Department of Energy. And when you testified before us, Deputy Secretary, that was 2.5 years ago, back in 2018. You know, hearing I chaired, the committee was looking at DOE, what steps Congress should take to ensure that the department, the economic, and are going to be confronting the nation. Or, given the committee's jurisdiction from the components of the Secretaries of Energy, and of Science, and you led off with number 2 of the department. So that formed legislative initiatives. For example, we ability to address emerging hazards, structure, to modernize the road, diplomacy to improve and advance nuclear and other energy policy, and to improve programs like minority workforce development, important to all of us. So fast forward to today, and many of these policy issues remain critical. The COVID-19 pandemic and the severe economic and energy sector impacts have highlighted why a well-functioning DOE is so important.
Mr. Upton, will you please suspend? You're breaking up, and we want to try to correct that problem. We are sitting on the edge of our seat trying to hear what you have to say.
I'll wait for your green light.
The gentleman will proceed.
Okay, in your own testimony, Mr. Secretary, you highlighted how DOE brought the capabilities of its scientific and technological advances, resources to the COVID fight. And data on compound screening with the supercomputer at Oak Ridge, the use of the Argonne Labs Advanced Photon Source User Facility to characterize the virus, and the work with leading tech companies illustrate the benefits of collaboration across the DOE complex with the private sector. And we heard testimony just to this point 2 years ago, and now we see how it can work in a crisis. Other missions of the department have been put to the test. The crisis in the energy sector with economic shutdown and the Russia-Saudi price war challenge your ability and our strategic energy responsibilities and American energy leaderships in new ways. I doubt anyone imagined some 40 years ago that our strategic petroleum reserve might be useful to just take on supply rather than disperse it in a crisis. You know, we might have to consider new strategic approaches to protect our energy security. Clearly, the pandemic exposed the security and strategic risks from ceding leadership on oil and gas and reminded us of the important role American energy resources and technology serves our national and strategic interests. Several Republican members on this panel are working on legislative reforms to help modernize energy infrastructure and increase American energy leadership. And that involves policies to strengthen our energy security, to promote and deploy cleaner energy, and modernizing regulatory requirements to ensure that DOE and the private sector innovation advances can be put into action. The recent crisis revealed to more Americans that the strategic threats of China, Russia, and other adversaries to our long-term economic and energy security. And this underscores the work that we must do to make sure that DOE has all the tools and the authorities necessary to safeguard and respond to threats to our critical electric infrastructure and the delivery and supply of energy. The President's recent bulk power system executive order underscores those risks, and DOE, I know, is at the center of responding to them. The increasing complex interconnections of our modern energy systems, from pipelines to power plants, present growing risks to that grid. Getting ahead of this requires secretarial leadership and a coordinated attempt across the Energy Department's programs and operations. And we ought to discuss what more is needed to advance your mission on that front today. Finally, growing nuclear weapons threats and the tens of billions of dollars needed to maintain the nuclear deterrent underscore the urgency for creating efficient, effective, and durable governance and management of DOE's nuclear security missions. So there are many topics here, Mr. Secretary. Your experience from the past, your experience now, that will help to identify, to address the challenges and how we all can work together on behalf of the country. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, the chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rush. Secretary Brouillette, welcome back to the committee. We're obviously glad that we have you before the committee in your role as secretary. I just wanted to begin by thanking the Department of Energy, particularly its national laboratories, for the research that they're conducting on COVID-19. Our committee has held numerous hearings and conducted a lot of oversight over the federal government's woefully inadequate response to the pandemic, and a response that has done very little to help alleviate the skyrocketing cases we're now seeing all around the nation. And while I continue to be critical of the administration's response, the research being conducted at the national labs is important to analyze the structure of the virus and the model as it spread. And I look forward to hearing more specifics on that effort, Mr. Secretary. The pandemic has also seriously damaged our economy, leaving millions of Americans unemployed. The severe economic downturn is impacting the energy sector, with the energy efficiency and renewable energy industries particularly hard hit. This subcommittee held a hearing last month with former Energy Secretary Moniz, who briefed us on the impact the pandemic has had on the energy sector, and we have to do more to aid the struggling renewable industry. Now, earlier this month, the House passed H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act, which would help us rebuild our economy and combat climate change. The bill invests more than $126 billion in clean energy, energy efficiency, and deep decarbonization. There's no better way to stimulate the economy and create millions of good-paying jobs, in my opinion, than to modernize our badly aging infrastructure. And the president has expressed interest in an infrastructure package, but he's going to need to exert some pressure on the Senate Majority Leader McConnell, who so far refuses to act on an infrastructure bill. And speaking of the Senate, I also want to discuss our nation's nuclear security mission, because the Senate continues to try to undermine that mission and the National Defense Authorization Act. Once again this year, the Senate Armed Services Chairman attempted to strip the DOE of much of its authority over the National Nuclear Security Administration, and this was a really wrong-headed effort that threatens the important long-standing principle of civilian, not military, control over the nuclear weapons stockpile. And it also stands to upend other non-nuclear weapons aspects of the DOE budget. Fortunately, an amendment by Senators Cantwell and Manchin scaled back the initial Senate language, but I do firmly believe that the Defense Department should not have its hand in the Energy Department's budgeting process, and instead we should be strengthening the Secretary of Energy's role in managing the nuclear security mission, because NNSA seems to be going from quasi-independent to completely rogue with each passing year. Now, turning to the bulk power system, I do have some concerns, Mr. Secretary, about the way DOE is implementing an executive order limiting the use of bulk power system equipment produced by foreign adversaries. I support this effort as part of our ongoing efforts to protect our grid, but I think there is quite a bit of confusion surrounding DOE's implementation of the order. With the prohibitions on acquiring and installing this equipment already in place, there is a pressing need for guidance for energy projects, many of which depend on complex supply chains, and I look forward to an update on the department's progress on finalizing this policy. I also wanted to touch finally on an issue that I pressed with your predecessor, Secretary Perry, and also Undersecretary Menzies. DOE has fallen far behind on its legal deadlines for updating appliance efficiency standards. And this is almost hard to believe, but DOE has now missed 26 statutory deadlines for updating efficiency standards. And I appreciate the department has recently and finally started the process of catching up on these deadlines by initiating rulemaking. But I also know that you have been putting quite a bit of resources into purely discretionary rulemaking, some of which seem designed to undercut rather than promote energy savings. For example, a discretionary interpretive rule in the works would make future improved efficiency standards for home furnaces almost impossible. So we need to see more action from DOE now to update and finalize critically efficient efficiency standards that save consumers money and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you again, Secretary Brouillette. Thank you for joining us today. I know it's always difficult, you know, with the COVID and with the doing things virtually. We go back and forth in terms of our ability to do everything virtually. But I do thank you for coming and being here today because this is a very important hearing. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chairman of the full committee yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Well, good morning or afternoon, depending upon which coast you're on, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing. I want to welcome Secretary Brouillette. It's great to have you back before the committee. Once again, you've provided really strong leadership over the last 7 months that you've been in office, and we appreciate that. And certainly you've been fighting the COVID virus and the pandemic as it worked its way across our country, across the world, and certainly in the energy industry. The unprecedented drop in oil prices has devastated the American gas and oil industry and costs upwards of 100,000 jobs. And the Department of Energy has been right in the action, helping our country respond to this terrible situation. And so going forward, the work is on top of the other important responsibilities that the department has, certainly. And these range from executing on the nation's nuclear deterrent mission to protecting our critical energy infrastructure, supporting a robust R&D program, keeping the nation's lab facilities and capabilities up to date, and cleaning up defense sites such as that at Hanford in Washington across the river from my district. Most people do not appreciate all of the responsibilities that you have at the Department of Energy. It's a national security agency, an energy security agency, having designed to produce every nuclear warhead in the U.S. arsenal, powering our nuclear navy, and serving critical roles in non-proliferation, national nuclear security, and other energy security missions. DOE is a world-class science, engineering, and technology agency. It's an environmental energy engineering and cleanup agency. All of this is interconnected across a complex national labs, production sites, and facilities involving a contractor workforce approaching 100,000 people. Managing this enterprise is never easy. It's a complicated job, and we know that. But the upshot is the tremendous benefits for the nation, for security, for science and innovation, for keeping America in the lead across the energy landscape. The key ingredient for success here is the innovative science and engineering capabilities fostered through a cohesive DOE enterprise and the multidisciplinary teamwork that emerges from that. This synergy among the weapons labs, the science labs, and the energy and environment labs are critical for success. Think about the supercomputing and big data capabilities of the agency, the computational science, the advancing computing architecture created by DOE's science and weapons programs is essential for modeling nuclear weapons stockpile. But the cross-mission benefits of this are clear. Look at the use of Oak Ridge's Summit computer to screen compounds for COVID-19 vaccine development. National security material science programs at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, which I've toured, have translated into technologies for scanning at airports, for cybersecurity protections, and even advanced battery production. And this works both ways. The advances in nuclear fuels and technology at the Idaho National Lab attracts the expertise and informs the knowledge base for Navy nuclear. You can extend this to other important missions. DOE's work on advanced nuclear, coupled with our work to ensure efficient NRC licensing for expanding peaceful use of atomic energy. This is the cornerstone of the nation's nuclear policy, a hallmark of civilian control of the nuclear enterprise, and an important tool not only for national security, but also a key solution to exporting cleaner energy around the world. Our duty on this committee and in this Congress is to make sure the Secretary has the tools and authority he or she needs to execute the department's missions. Our goal is to maximize the benefits of the DOE enterprise for America. So I look forward to exploring what more we can do to be of assistance today, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. And I want to share the concerns expressed by the chairman of the full committee with regards to the NDAA and what it does, purports to do to the civilian side of the nuclear weapons program, and to diminish the important role of the Secretary of Energy. And Chairman Pelote and I are working together shoulder to shoulder on fixing this problem in the legislation the House is going to take up. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time and look forward to the discussion.
The ranking member yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statement shall be made a part of the committee's records. And now it is my pleasure and honor to welcome once again before this committee our witness for today's hearing. As been noted, Secretary Brouillette is a former staff director on this committee, and we certainly want to welcome him back as the Secretary of Energy to testify before this committee. Mr. Secretary, once again, we welcome you. I enjoyed our conversation on yesterday, and we look forward to your testimony. But before we begin, Mr. Secretary, I would like to explain, I don't think I have to, but it says that I should explain the lighting system. In front of you is a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. And please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red when your time expires. Secretary Brouillette, again, welcome back to the committee, subcommittee rather, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the honor of being here again, and thank you for that gentle reminder. I must say it's much better to be on that side of the dais than on this side, but thank you for that gentle reminder. And also my compliments on that mask. I think you are rivaling our dearly departed friend, Ron Dellums, as the best dressed man in Congress. You're doing quite well. But thank you, Chairman Rush. Thank you, Ranking Member Upton, as well as Full Committee Chairman Pallone and Ranking Member Mr. Walden. It's an honor to appear before you today to discuss the United States Department of Energy's response to COVID-19. And I failed to mention, Mr. Rush, I'd also like to thank you for your warm welcome. at our artificial intelligence event last fall in Chicago. The hospitality could not have been better. Thank you for that, sir. I appreciate that. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States, President Trump very early on directed the whole of government approach to defeating this virus. And I'm proud to report to you that DOE's national labs and their world-class facilities have been on the front lines of this important mission. 7 of our labs are partners in the COVID-19 High-Performance Computing Consortium, which the President announced in March. This public-private partnership, which is spearheaded by the White House, DOE, and IBM, including government, industry, and academic leaders, is unleashing the power of America's supercomputing resources to combat COVID-19 all around the globe. We're very excited about the growing international participation in this consortium to battle the pandemic worldwide. We at DOE have established a national virtual biotechnology laboratory, which is using the full range of our facilities in the effort against COVID-19. We've set up a portal which will enable America's innovators to easily access essential resources and connect and partner with experts at all of our national laboratories. And as the chairman mentioned, the scientists have used Argonne Laboratories' advanced photon source to characterize more than a dozen proteins, which are potential targets for medicines and countermeasures from COVID-19, including one that allows it to hide from the immune system, and working with our Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, another protein that enables it to reproduce. Researchers at Oak Ridge have screened more than 8,000 drug compounds for 77 that have potential use in this fight. Oak Ridge is also helping mass produce healthcare supplies such as masks and face shields, and they're doing it in record time. They're also producing and developing low-cost N95 respirators that can be cleaned and later reused. Scientists at the Berkeley lab are using the facilities there to identify neutralizing antibodies that could be used as preventative treatments or post-exposure therapies. This COVID-19 pandemic has also led to challenges that go well beyond the virus itself. In March, we faced an oversupply of oil due to some decisions made by key nations following the collapse of OPEC Plus negotiations, while also facing a nearly catastrophic decline in demand due obviously to the pandemic. The President facilitated an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Russia, the co-chairs of OPEC Plus, on terms that were favorable to the United States. As the largest energy producer and consumer in the world, we were able to engage other nations from a position of strength and authority, and the agreement brought stability to energy markets around the world, and it helped produce or protect America's energy producers. Following through on President Trump's direction, we opened the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to store excess oil from U.S. producers. Crude oil deliveries from approximately 21 million barrels to the SPR have now been completed. DOE is also working closely with states and stakeholders to ensure that renewable energy and energy efficiency sectors make it to the other side of this pandemic. In addition, our EERE office is working with the National Association of State Energy Officials to develop post-COVID economic development proposals using existing resources. We also worked with our nation's governors and public and private sector partners to ensure that our critical energy infrastructure was fully operational. DOE assisted the industry with access to personal protective equipment and testing kits. We ensured the inclusion of the energy section in workers in the Department of Homeland Security's guidance on essential critical infrastructure workforce, which promoted the ability of such workers to continue working during the closure orders and with social distancing. And similarly, the department engaged in planning processes to sequester control center personnel on site to ensure continuity of operations. As we return to full operations, we're renewing our energy endeavors and refocusing on important new priorities. The bulk power system, the backbone of the nation's electric grid, is coming under increasing threat from foreign adversaries. On May 1st, President Trump signed an executive order to increase its security. My team and I will continue to work with other federal departments and industry partners to eliminate vulnerabilities and develop policies to ensure its security and resiliency. That's my hope today, to make our nation safer and stronger, more prosperous, and more filled with promise than ever before. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity. I look forward to answering your questions.
Witness, and now we will proceed to questions, and the chair will recognize members on each, the Democratic members for 5 minutes, recognize Republican members for 5 minutes, and now the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning the witness. Secretary Brouillette, for the past 5 years, the U.S. Energy and Employment Report, also known as USEER, has served as an essential resource for energy sector workforce insights. In view of current unemployment numbers and the woeful representation of minorities within the energy sector, these insights are now needed more than ever. Last December, the Congress appropriated $1.7 million for the 6th annual USEER and reiterated the importance of its using data collection methods consistent with previous installments to ensure accuracy. This means data collections should begin this September. Secretary Brouillette, what progress, if any, has the department made toward producing the next USEER report, and will it be on time?
To answer that last question, sir, it will be on time. I have had many conversations with former Secretary Ernie Moniz about this as recently as this weekend, as a matter of fact. It is our commitment to you that we're going to continue to provide this type of information, this type of data to the U.S. Congress. I have proposed that we add some data collection to this particular process. We are, in fact, slightly behind with the data collection. There is no secret to that. I will own that responsibility. We have fallen slightly behind, primarily because of the COVID. We're working remotely. But nonetheless, we plan to contract with a data collection service very quickly. We will do that data collection all throughout August, September, and October of this year. We will then prepare the final report toward the end of this year and submit it to you.
Well, thank you. How will DOE deploy its resources to include those within the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity to address job losses and diversity and inclusion?
Well, sir, it's a broad-based effort that we have at the Department of Energy. It focuses on not only the department itself, it goes well beyond that and into the industry, but I'll focus my comments on the department itself and let you know what we have done since our last conversation, which was, I think, approximately 18 months ago when I was before the committee. You tasked me at that point to take a look at this, and I have done that. And I want to report just really quickly. We have now revitalized what we refer to as our Minorities in Energy program at the department. When I came back from that hearing, I immediately tasked James Campos, who I think you've met with many times, to do exactly that. And the result of that effort is what we refer to as the new Equity and Energy Initiative. And it's designed to advise me as the secretary, but also expand the inclusion and participation in individuals in underserved communities in all programs at DOE and the energy sector more broadly. And I will tell you from my perspective as the secretary, I'll give you some quick results. The new hire diversity at the Department of Energy in fiscal year 17, There were 17% minorities that were hired as new hires. I'm happy to report to you that in fiscal year 20, this year, that number has now jumped to 31%. So the program is working. James is doing a great job leading that effort. I'm proud of the fact that we are the only department, or one of the only departments, that has a program that's completely dedicated to this. And as you know, sir, James is a Senate-confirmed person, so it's a very high-ranking position within our department, and I think he's doing a great job. We're going to continue the good work in this program.
Mr. Secretary, I have just a few seconds left. Would you also address the FEMP program? I mentioned that on the phone to you yesterday, and what's the status of the FEMP program?
The FEMP program is moving forward, sir. I think there's a couple things. Energy efficiency in federal buildings is key to energy savings. I know that Chairman Pallone and others have mentioned some other energy efficiency programs that deal with appliances, but one of the greatest savings that we can find is in the federal complex itself. And I just recently had an opportunity to visit the roof of the Department of Energy, and I noticed that there are some solar panels up there that are badly outdated, and we need to update them. So I'm going to work with Ms. Capter on the Appropriations Committee and potentially find some additional resources that we can upgrade the efficiencies within our own department, but also work with other agencies to do exactly the same thing. That's where some of our greatest savings will come from.
Thank you. My time is concluded. Yield back whatever I have remaining. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning the witness.
Well, thanks again, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, I want to ask a couple questions, but I'd like to begin on focusing on grid security. Back in May, the President issued an executive order to secure the U.S. bulk power system, and having many of us a number of classified briefings, it's crystal clear that the threats to the bulk power system by foreign adversaries constitutes what could be a real national emergency. The grid is absolutely fundamental to our critical infrastructure, our national security, and our economy. If a foreign adversary were able to take control or degrade electrical equipment such as a transformer, we could be in very serious trouble. So what is the status of DOE's rulemaking to implement the executive order? And are there statutory authorities that Congress should consider that would provide DOE, that could provide DOE on a more promising basis?
Yeah, there we go. Now it's on. Thank you, sir, for that question. I appreciate the opportunity to respond. With regard to additional authorities that are needed, I'm not quite sure that's necessary at this point. We have moved forward with implementation of the executive order. I know that there is some confusion or perceived confusion in the industry. We want to alleviate the industry of any anxiety it might have about this as we move forward with a proposed rule later this year. Just to elucidate a little bit about what it does, you know, as you mentioned, sir, the bulk power system is the backbone of the electric grid. It underpins everything in America with regard to our electric system. But what we're doing is we're seeking to operationalize the executive order through 4 pillars to implement it. And I'll just run through them real quickly. One, we want to prohibit foreign adversaries from supplying particular bulk power system electrical equipment. We want to establish a list of pre-qualified vendors that the utility industry can use to purchase from. We want to develop an advisory recommendations for the identification, the isolation, the monitoring, and the replacement of any currently at-risk equipment that's on the system. That does not mean, however, that we're going to rip and replace the entire electric grid in the United States. We're focused on the bulk power system, not at this moment or any other moment in the near term, the distribution system. And then importantly, what the President has directed me to do is to create a task force. I will convene with others, the Secretary of Defense in particular, so that we can begin the process of perhaps recommending to you, the Congress, certain procurement policies that are going to be directly related to this national security mission.
Thanks. Should we be doing anything about gas pipelines as it relates to their safety?
I'm sorry, Mr. Upton, I didn't hear that question.
Is there anything that we should do regarding gas pipelines?
You know, Mr. Upton, you have a long history in the telecommunications world, And if I were to point to one thing that we can do an even more aggressive job with regard to pipelines, it would be in the area of cybersecurity. The major pipelines are doing just fine. We work with them very closely. They're very much a part and parcel to what we do at DOE. The CEOs are very engaging and collaborative. If I have a concern about pipelines in America today, it is perhaps with regard to some of the smaller members of the industry. They simply, in some cases, just do not have the resources that are needed to protect the infrastructure in the manner in which we would like to see it be protected. I would look forward to working with you, members of the committee, others in the industry, to help design programs and policies that might address what I think is a growing national security concern.
Finally, let me just ask you about a bill that I introduced a few weeks ago, H.R. 7435. It's the Methane Emissions Reduction Act. It authorizes DOE to reduce methane emissions from flaring and venting natural gas in production activities. As you know, states are the primary regulators of oil and gas production activities, so it's not a DOE regulatory program. The goal is to get DOE to work with the state, certainly Michigan, to provide and accelerate the most promising R&D innovative new technology to reduce methane emissions. While the oil and natural gas produced in the U.S. is already moving among the cleanest in the world, would you agree that there is more that we can do to reduce methane emissions even further?
No, I'm mute now. I didn't hear the last part.
Would you agree that it would be advisable to reduce methane emissions more than what we do today and be able to work with the states?
Yes, I do agree. Methane is a very intense carbon or a very intense greenhouse gas, and I think it's important that we reduce the emissions. While I recognize, as you pointed out, this may be an issue perhaps better addressed in the EPA world, I would also report to the members of the committee that we are working with the industry, and we have looked at various technologies that might help with methane emissions. I was just recently in Pennsylvania. I saw some product there that is actually made from coal. After the refining process in coal, you're left with a very fine powder which can be added to a natural gas pipeline, which actually works to seal the pipeline in a manner that contains the methane. So perhaps will help the industry over the long term to reduce these types of emissions.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I wanted to try to get in this 5 minutes some questions about the Secretary's or your role or authority over NNSA, and then I wanted to ask a little bit about the appliance efficiency rules. So I'll try to get through it. The Secretary, there's been efforts over the years, as you know, to strip away the Secretary of Energy's authority over NNSA, and most recently to strengthen the Nuclear Weapons Council's authority in determining NNSA's budget within the Secretary's own department. Just tell me why you think this is a wrong approach.
Well, sir, let me see where I can start with that. I think it's important to recognize, as I think Chairman Rush mentioned and Chairman Walden alluded to, Ranking Member Walden alluded to, not many people understand the Department of Energy and its actual mission. They don't know the breadth of the portfolio, the breadth of the mission. Every year, the Secretary of Energy, along with the Secretary of Defense, must certify the stockpile. And in essence, in plain language, ensure to the President that it will do what he or she would like it to do if they needed to use it. That certification process is signed at the cabinet level. And it is important that the Secretary of Energy see the entire process for the development of the budget, the operations within NNSA, all of the activities that occur within the National Weapons Labs, in order to remain comfortable that that certification is in fact solid, for lack of a better term. It's very important that I see that.
And then I think this is extremely helpful. I'm concerned about the impact these, what NNSA, what the Nuclear Weapons Council is trying to do is going to have a negative impact on DOE and its budget. But from a broader perspective, some argue the NNSA mission is more aligned with the Department of Defense. Why should NNSA be housed in the Department of Energy? Why would you disagree that it should be more defense-oriented?
Well, you know, the security of the national security enterprise writ large, it's always been firmly grounded, always been firmly grounded. If you look back at the history of the department, all the way back to the Atomic Energy Commission, our predecessor, it's grounded in the science, the technology, the engineering, and the manufacturing expertise of the DOE National Laboratory System. And NNSA draws heavily upon the various elements of all of the DOE laboratories and the sites, and it creates a synergy that can't be replicated anywhere else in the U.S. government. It certainly can't be replicated within the DOD complex.
All right, and then I wanted to just in the last 2 minutes about the appliance efficiency rules. We've already had a little discussion. How many efficiency rules do you expect to finalize between now and the end of the year? And those, how many respond to statutory deadlines and how many are discretionary? I know that this problem was inherited by you. I'm not suggesting that you created it, but I'd like to know how many efficiency rules you do expect to finalize between now and the end of the year, and how that, which ones are statutory and which ones are discretionary, if you could.
To be honest, and to be just point blank, sir, I'll do as many as I possibly can. I know this has been an issue for you. I know that you have raised it with our Undersecretary, Mark Menzies. I appreciate the concern you have. I reviewed Mark's answer before the committee. I agree with it. I think he's correct about some of those things. But I just want to let you know that I will do as many as I can before the end of this year. And I'll just tell you really quickly, thus far in 2020, we have published 18 notices that are related to conservation standards and 9 notices that are relating to test procedures. And that's about 3 times more than what we did in 2018. So we are beginning to make some real progress here, and you have my firm commitment that we will move as aggressively as we possibly can.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, the number of missed legal deadlines for new standards has grown from 3 to 26 since President Trump took office. I don't blame you because you haven't been there that long, but I do blame the Trump administration in general. And I'd like to see you focus more on meeting legal deadlines and less on discretionary rules that undercut energy savings. But thank you for that response. Thank you for being with us today. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning the witness.
Chairman, Mr. Secretary, again for your leadership of the agency and your commitment to meeting these deadlines. As you know, as I mentioned, Chairman Pallone and I have jointly teamed up on an amendment that integrates personnel of DOE and NNSA so legal, budgetary, and other mission support functions operate more effectively across the DOE enterprise, and the administrator can focus more effectively on mission execution consistent with DOE authorities. So my question is, why does it make sense from your perspective for the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Energy to co-chair the Nuclear Weapons Council, the NWC? Why does that make sense?
Well, Mr. Walden, thank you for that. I think the first reason it makes sense is because it recognizes the prioritization and the importance the nation places on our nuclear deterrent. It elevates the visibility and, frankly, the accountability of our nuclear deterrent, and it better ensures the fidelity of the budget process in both of our agencies. I think it's important to recognize that, you know, for instance, the Secretary of Energy not only has responsibility for the warhead program, I also have the responsibility ultimately for the cleanup of the manufacturing processes that are used in the development of the warheads under our environmental management program. Both of these are funded with defense dollars, 050 dollars, and if you think about it as a pie, what I think some of the Senate language would do is to, if you think about it as a pie, if you take one piece and make it bigger, the other pieces are typically going to get smaller. So in the case of the environmental management program, if you have a sub-cabinet council within the Department of Defense focused exclusively on the weapons portion of the budget, what might happen is that the weapons program gets much, much larger at the expense of the environmental management program. Only the Secretary of Energy is in the position to balance the needs all across the programs. Now, with that said, I think it's important to suggest that, look, I am a very strong supporter of the weapons program. That deterrent is critical to our national security. It has to be robust. There are many things that we have to do to improve its performance. But at the same time, it is also important, it's imperative that we honor our moral obligations to clean up the facilities once we're done with the manufacture.
Well, I appreciate that. And, Representative District that's right across the river from Hanford, where there are, I think, 140 some enormous big buried tanks of nuclear sludge left over from the Manhattan Project. And tunnels that continue to collapse at times and release radiation. That cleanup effort is essential to the public health.
Will the ranking member please yield? Members who are on the participating remotely, will you please mute your phone until you I ask you to unmute? Will members please mute your phone, those who are remotely participating in this hearing? We're getting feedback. The gentleman will proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Anyway, I'm very concerned about making sure we stay on pace to get the Hanford mess cleaned up that dates clear back to World War II. On another matter, can you describe how you work with the Defense Department to plan and budget for the nation's defense nuclear programs?
All right, Mr. Walden, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, if you can talk about how you work with the Department of Defense on the budgeting for the nation's nuclear weapons programs, that would be good. And does the language in the NDAA, does that make you subordinate as a cabinet secretary to an undersecretary at DOD?
Well, I think some of the original drafts of the amendment perhaps would have done that. The way it typically works is that the DOD sets the requirements, the military requirements that it wants to, and it does it through the nuclear posture review in the case of the warhead program. What we do at DOE is match our manufacturing capabilities to their military requirements. This is coordinated through the Nuclear Weapons Council, which is chaired by an Undersecretary of Defense, and then the Undersecretary of Energy who runs the NNSA is also a member, as well as the chairman of STRATCOM and other important members of the military complex. Together, they review those requirements, and then we establish a budget based upon their requirements. My understanding of some of the early Senate language was that I would be required to submit the DOE budget to the Weapons Council. So in that sense, the Secretary would be subordinated to a sub-council within DOE. And I think the language would have further required that I accept their recommendations and further send those to OMB and then ultimately to Congress for consideration. As I mentioned earlier, if that were the process that the Congress were to adopt, it would present some unique problems to the cleanup facilities all across the world. You asked earlier, though, about the importance of, the elevation and maybe moving this to the Secretary's level and perhaps providing both the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Energy some additional line of sight. I think it's also important to remember that, as direct reports to the President and as members of the National Security Council, perhaps the both of us are in the best position to balance the needs of our respective departments.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've run out of time. Thanks for your leadership and for answering our questions. We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes. I see that Mr. Peters is not available. Now the chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rush and Ranking Member Upton for holding this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. We're anxious to get you down to the NETL in Pittsburgh, and I can promise you some Permane Brothers sandwiches and Iron City beer after the meeting. So hope we can set that up soon. This pandemic has upended everyone's life, and it's causing tremendous damage to every part of our economy, the energy sector included. We need a national strategy, not only to combat climate change, but to help our economic recovery once it's safe to do so. And I believe there's many pathways that we can take towards rebuilding our economy and creating a sustainable future. And I hope we can count on the Department of Energy's extensive capabilities to be a partner in these efforts. Mr. Secretary, not only has this pandemic resulted in over 1 million energy sector jobs being lost, but it's also brought much lower wholesale energy prices. Even before this drop, many nuclear power plants were struggling to stay open. Tell me, what policies can we enact to ensure that we don't shut down more well-run nuclear power plants? And how can we ensure, as advanced nuclear technology becomes commercialized, that we're building these plants in communities that have been hurt by the closing of industry or fossil fuel plants?
So thank you, Mr. Doyle, for that question. I appreciate your concern. I have a similar concern as well. I think that in the case of nuclear, we have too many facilities that are closing at a much too early or a much too aggressive rate. We have begun a process. I just visited a facility down in Florida to help permit life extension permits for these facilities. The one that I visited in Florida is now authorized to operate for up to 80 years, very, very safely, I might add. It's very important that we look at these facilities and grant those types of permits, and we'll be working closely with our colleagues at the NRC and others to ensure that moves forward. That's one step. The second step is to follow up on the outline or the strategy that we put forth in our nuclear fuels working group. In that working group, we are developing various proposals. There's about 10. It's one to address what we can see as a concern in America related to the front end of the fuel cycle. We want to develop our mining capabilities in uranium. We want to establish a uranium reserve. We importantly want to develop conversion and enrichment services here in America so that the civilian fleet can buy from American fuel supply. We think that adds to our national security. It's also important that we address some of the needs for advanced reactors, and that's also part of this working group's report, is that we're going to develop accident-tolerant fuels. We're going to develop what is known as high-assay LEU, low-enriched uranium. It's important for us to develop this fuel because it is what will allow these smaller reactors to come online, and hopefully we can catalyze enough investment and enough market interest in these that we can have them replace some of these older, aging, and in some cases, too large facilities. Nuclear has a unique characteristic or a unique challenge, I should say, at certain times. They produce an enormous amount of electricity. And it's not always needed as these communities begin to develop. It's not always needed. We don't need 1 gigawatt of power, perhaps, as we move to a more distributed electrical grid all throughout the country. We need perhaps smaller forms of generation.
Well, thank you. As we add more intermittent power to the grid, flexibility seems to be vital into making sure the grid's reliable, and energy storage obviously is key to that. Can you provide us with a quick update on the ongoing activities being undertaken by the department's Grand Energy Storage Challenge? What specific actions are going on right now?
Sure. Well, what we've announced is a grand challenge. What we're looking for is a next generation of grid-scale storage, or the next generation of battery storage. But importantly, we need to find battery technologies that would allow us to bring to market grid-scale storage. It's critical that we do this very, very quickly so that we can continue to see the implementation and development of renewable technologies. If we're going to lose our baseload power at the rate in which we're losing it, at some point I'm afraid that we might have a gap. And as you know, and as members of the committee know so very well, today at least with the technologies that we have, renewable power depends almost entirely upon the provision of baseload electricity all throughout the country. So if we're going to lose that base load at the rate in which we're losing it, and we're not going to be able to build enormous nuclear plants, as we just discussed, then it's important that we develop the battery technologies. We did announce the launch pad out at PNNL. It's going to be a brand new facility, a brand new laboratory that we will use to help develop some of these newer battery technologies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you. Look forward to seeing you in Pittsburgh. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Lana, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding today's hearing. And thanks very much to the Secretary for appearing before us today. Greatly appreciate it. Even before the outbreak of COVID-19, the United States was faced with a range of challenges that threaten the stability and security of our energy interests, including the threat of cyber attacks to our grid security, nuclear supply chain vulnerabilities, and threats to the competitiveness of our domestic nuclear industry. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has only made these problems worse. On the issues of the nuclear supply chain and the need to maintain a durable domestic nuclear industry, we need to pursue policies that will be good for our economy and consistent with our security policies to counter Russia and China. These policies include building robust sources for domestic uranium and conversion. I'm pleased to see DOE's efforts to support the establishment of a uranium reserve, and I appreciate the assistance your staff has provided my office as we draft legislation to authorize this reserve. We must also support efforts to improve our nation's grid security and resiliency against cyber threats. Two bipartisan bills that I have led on, H.R. 359 and H.R. 360, along with my good friend, the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, have helped DOE in this effort, and I hope the chairman will work with us in a bipartisan way to see these bills soon come to the floor for a vote. Mr. Secretary, on the nuclear issues I've raised, how vital is it that the United States build up its own domestic nuclear supply chain, and how will a strategic uranium reserve help us do this?
The button's there it goes. The button wasn't coming on there for a minute. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's absolutely critical that we develop and more further develop the front end of the fuel cycle here in America. You know, we've lost our leadership edge in America with regard to the provision of nuclear power. And today, I don't have the exact number, but the vast majority of the fuel that is purchased by the civilian nuclear fleet here in the United States is purchased primarily from Russia. And they supply the fuel chain. So if we were to lose that, I think we endanger Americans all across the country, and that's very important for us to address. That's what we're attempting to do. We think we should create a reserve, a uranium reserve, that includes not just pulling the uranium out of the mine, but all of the processes that go along with it. So the conversion process, the enrichment process. We think we need to bring these businesses back to America to ensure the security of our fleet and to ensure the security of the provision of electric power here in the United States. So that's the commitment of our administration. That's what we're looking for support for in this nuclear fuels working group.
Well, thanks very much, because I appreciate what DOE is doing. And would you support legislation then that would ensure the durability of a program like this by specifically authorizing it?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, great. I really appreciate it. On the grid security issues in your testimony, you referenced the administration's concerns about securing the bulk power system as evidenced by the president's executive order in May. How important is it to secure the bulk power system against cyber threats? And do you believe that legislation like H.R. 360, which establishes a voluntary cyber-sense program to test the cybersecurity of products and technologies intended for use in the bulk power system, would be helpful in this effort?
I would certainly work with you to develop legislation and look for the authorities that might be helpful. I feel that we have most of what we need at this moment in time, but I'd be very much agreeable to working with you on a potential bill that might further address some of the issues. With regard to the bulk power thing and what we're seeing all throughout the industry and what we have noticed in some of the power marketing administrations that we run at DOE, like BPA and what is known as WAPA, the Western Area Power Administration, we have noticed that much of the manufacturing for the equipment that goes into our system is being made in China. And China, as we know, has changed its doctrinal approach to the United States, and they've become more and more of an adversarial nation. And what we're beginning to be concerned about is perhaps the provision of some technologies within the equipment that we're purchasing that allows communications back to Beijing, or it may allow some manipulation of the electric grid because of the equipment that's being placed into things like transformers. So we've identified this. We're working very closely with one of our national laboratories. We're evaluating a certain piece of equipment right now that's in the public domain. And we look forward to providing some reports not only to the intelligence community within the interagency, but also to the United States Congress as well as to our findings there.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Sarbanes of Maryland for 5 minutes. Mr. Sarbanes, are you there? The chair now recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes. I understand Mr. Sarbanes is having some problems unmuting his microphone. Mr. Sarbanes, we will return to you as soon as you're ready. Mr. McNerney, are you there?
Yes, I am unmuted now. Can you hear me?
All right. Mr. McNerney, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman and the ranking member for the hearing. It's a very timely topic, and I thank the secretary for showing up and helping us understand what's going on out there in the Department of Energy. You know, the Lawrence Livermore Labs and Sandia Laboratories, national laboratories, are just outside of my district. Mr. Secretary, could you go over a little bit of what these two laboratories are doing with regard to the pandemic?
Sure. There we go. So, yes, sir, and I'll get you a very detailed report on some of the activities that are occurring in those labs, but in a very high-level way, I will tell you that both labs have been engaged. What we've done is we've utilized the bioscience capabilities, in particular of those two labs, to help identify the proteins that are unique to this particular coronavirus. And as we've done that, we've been able to advise some of the doctors about the reactions to certain drugs. We've been able to predict in certain cases the spread of the virus. Both labs have been very capable artificial intelligence experts there, and they've helped us design predictive modeling in certain cases that can, in certain cases, go all the way down to the county level. And they've been very, very aggressive in doing that. We appreciate their support.
Well, good. I look forward to the detailed reports that you have there, Mr. Secretary. As you noted in your testimony, our nation's electric grid, the bulk power grid, is coming under increasing pressure. This has been discussed by a couple of other of our members here this morning. I'm concerned that the executive office is not doing enough to counter the threat beyond issuing the executive order. Can you provide us in a committee an update on Russia's cybersecurity capability as they relate to the grid, and why hasn't the president been more aggressive on addressing their capabilities?
I didn't hear the first part of that question. I apologize.
Well, basically, the nation's coming under our bulk grid is coming under increasing threat, particularly from Russia. And what I'd like to know is, what is Russia's capability, and what has the administration done to counter that other than just issuing an executive order?
Capabilities with regard to what?
The cyber attack capabilities.
Oh, cyber attack capabilities. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that when you first answered the question. Asked the question. Russia is a very sophisticated cyber actor in the marketplace. What we have done at the Department of Energy is to utilize our supercomputing capabilities in places like Oak Ridge, at PNNL out in Washington State. And we've begun very aggressively applying things like artificial intelligence to cyber technologies. And what it's allowed us to do is to blunt many of the attacks that we see coming from places like Russia. And I would dare say that they are perhaps the most sophisticated cyber actor in the marketplace today, perhaps followed very closely by China and then by Iran. But that's our contribution to this national effort that's being led by a number of different players, including the U.S. Department of Defense Cyber Command.
Well, honestly, I haven't seen any evidence of aggressive administration action to counter that threat. So I think that it would be in the nation's interest to acknowledge that threat publicly so that Americans are aware of it, and also to help identify what we can do to prevent that and to counter that. Going on, as you may be aware, I'm the lead sponsor of the Nuclear Waste Amendments Policy Act of 2019, along with Mr. Shimkus. The bipartisan bill passed out of committee unanimously, which shows that there's a significant supporting in the House and in this committee to move forward with nuclear waste handling. So what I'm wondering is, considering the decades-long standstill over the debate on the Yucca Mountain, how does the administration envision developing a science-based solution that can earn the approval of the states involved?
Yes, sir. With regard to your first question, I'd be happy, sir, to come up and brief you in a classified setting on some of the activities around Russian cyber activity. I'd be happy to do that at your convenience. So I'll reach out to your office and schedule something, if you don't mind.
Okay, appreciate that.
With regard to, spent fuel storage, as you know, the Congress has been deadlocked on funding for that particular program for many, many years. Our authority to do anything is restricted somewhat by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. We are using the scientific capabilities within the Department of Energy, our nuclear expertise, to potentially explore other options. We're somewhat limited. We can look at interim storage ideas, but only within a very small window and a very small window of authority in the current law. So I'm happy to share those with you. I will come back and brief you at your convenience on that as well.
Okay, I'll be glad to work with you on that, Mr. Secretary. It's an important issue that we need to solve, so thank you. I yield back.
Sure.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. McMorris Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Brouillette, for being here today, being with us today. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the work of the Department of Energy and what you're doing to secure America's future and ensure the safety of our grid from foreign adversaries, whether it's Russia or China or others. I share some of my other colleagues' concerns about provisions in the Senate NDAA that threaten to undermine the Secretary of Energy's management and oversight of our nuclear weapons program. As been pointed out, this misguided effort would erode the Secretary's budgetary oversight of the National Security Administration, the Nuclear Security Administration, with the unprecedented insertion of the Nuclear Weapons Council into DOE's budget preparation and oversight process. The American atomic energy programs have been under civilian control since the end of World War II, and the establishment of the Atomic Energy Commission, DOE's predecessor, I believe maintaining clear civilian and cabinet level oversight of our nuclear weapons program is essential for our nation. Moves that insert the Defense Department into DOE's planning could also have a harmful impact on other important priorities, like the ongoing cleanup of our country's nuclear production complexes. Just outside my district, near the Tri-Cities in Washington State is the Hanford site, which others have mentioned. And it produced plutonium for the Manhattan Project during World War II. The inventions in nuclear technology at Hanford helped end the war and begin our nation's global leadership in nuclear energy. However, these early developments in nuclear technology came at a cost. And after 40 years of production, Hanford now has to undergo a massive ongoing cleanup of radioactive material. Secretary Brouillette, thank you for your leadership in ensuring authority and control over nuclear weapon programs remain fully within DOE under your cabinet level control. Could you explain how the provisions in the Senate NDA would have negative consequences for cleaning up former nuclear production, such as at Hanford, or other important priorities?
Yes, ma'am. I'll do exactly that. I think I need to go and look and see what is the current status of the NDAA in the Senate and see what language. I know that there was a few amendments offered just prior to the bill's consideration on the floor. I will go and do that. But importantly, as I understand the first drafts of the NDAA, as we saw it in the public domain, it would have subordinated the Secretary of Energy and perhaps even the Secretary of Defense at some level to the Nuclear Weapons Council. And what it did was it would have required me to submit the U.S. Department of Energy budget to that council for their consideration, and they would provide the recommendations to the department, of which I would be required under the original drafts to submit that to the OMB and potentially to the Congress as well. In that case, what we would have is sub-cabinet level officials determining not only the weapons program budget, but perhaps disastrously altering other programs within not only the Department of Energy, but the Department of Defense as well. As I explained in one of the earlier questions, if we think about the budget as a pie, if you make one piece bigger, because of the budget caps that are in place in the federal law, by definition, the other pieces of the pie have to get smaller. And because the environmental management program is also funded by defense dollars, making the weapons program bigger without some adjustment to the cap would by definition make the environmental management or the cleanup portion of that particular budget smaller. And I think that as the Secretary of Energy, I'm perhaps in the better position to make that judgment about what balance should be struck between these two important programs. I fully support the weapons program, but I also understand the moral obligation we have to clean up sites like Hanford.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you on that. Also, just wanted another critical issue is the national security around safeguarding our grid. And I'm especially concerned about potential vulnerabilities in critical components manufactured by foreign adversaries such as China and Russia. I applaud the administration's swift action to protect the grid from these foreign threats by prohibiting such critical bulk power components from being installed in our grid through the executive order signed by President Trump back in May. I believe the federal government needs to involve the energy sector, including domestic vendors and manufacturers, to ensure this order is implemented effectively. Mr. Secretary, would you commit to working closely with the stakeholders at DOE to develop the further rulemaking to do so?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You have my commitment for that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Young ladies, time is up. She yields back. The chair now understands that Mr. Sarbanes is ready for his 5 minutes. He's recognized for 5 minutes for questioning the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
We hear you quite well.
Okay, thanks very much. There's an echo, I think. There we go. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the hearing. Obviously, this pandemic has had a profound effect on the economy. The energy sector has certainly felt that as well. And as we look to stimulate the economy moving forward and recover, we can build on an economy that's more equitable, more resilient, and promotes a cleaner and healthier future for our communities. I know we feel strongly about that. I wanted to focus my questions for the Secretary today on renewable energy, specifically solar energy. The Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EERE, has been a smart return on investment for taxpayers, a net benefit, I think, of about $230 billion. And particularly for low-income families, these kinds of programs in EERE help reduce barriers, allow low-income communities to reduce energy consumption, which also saves money. In fact, ACEEE has found that for families living in large cities, the average low-income household's energy burden was more than 3 times as high as that of non-low-income households, 7% compared with about 2% for their wealthier counterparts. And certainly during this time of economic instability, reducing that energy burden and cost savings is one way we can help those communities move forward. Solar energy in particular has been an economic driver, employing over 240,000 Americans, generating $17 billion in investment in our nation's economy. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, we've deployed 37% less solar capacity than was forecasted, and developers have had difficulty securing financing under these conditions. And again, it disproportionately impacts small businesses, newer companies, and ultimately impacts households. Secretary Brouillette, in your testimony, you mentioned the administration's support for solar in the portfolio, but I have to say that the administration's budget doesn't reflect that support. There was a proposed cut of over 70% to the ERE and the Solar Energy Technologies Office, which we've tried to reverse, I'm pleased to say, in the House appropriations bill that's been released. But in the face of such economic uncertainty, I would hope that we could count on DOE to promote solar energy, which has all of these benefits that are related to workforce, cost to consumers, and so forth. I feel this particularly because in Baltimore, we've worked in the past with the Department of Energy to bring this potential to low-income homeowners through a program called Baltimore Shines, and it would allow all communities to take advantage of low-cost solar energy. Mr. Secretary, will you commit to ensuring that communities, especially low-income and vulnerable communities, are able to take advantage of the low-cost energy and skilled job opportunities offered by solar technology as we are trying to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Mr. Sarbanes, yes, I can. And as a resident of Maryland, that hits particularly close to home for me. So thank you for your service. Thank you for the question. I look forward to working with you on this. We do support solar technologies, and I'll just tell you really quickly what we're looking at. We're looking at some of the next generation of solar technologies. Much of what's on the market today, photovoltaic type technologies, I don't want to call them antiquated. They're not completely antiquated, but they've been around for a very long time and they're somewhat mature. So when we look at the investing research dollars at the Department of Energy, we've made a decision that perhaps rather than continuing investments in mature technologies like photovoltaics, we want to move to the next generation, and we'll work very closely with our National Renewable Energy Laboratory out in Golden, Colorado, to develop things like perovskites, which is a fascinating technology and increases the efficiency of the solar panel itself. So I would love to have you out there. We have technologies where literally you paint a window and the window itself becomes a small electric generation machine, or it's able to develop enough electricity to power some small appliances. It's a fascinating technology. It's that type of technology I'd like to see come to market much more quickly. With regard to energy efficiency, it's also important that we balance not only the energy savings that are developed by these types of newer technologies, but also the cost of the appliance or the cost of the generation itself. In our view, we agree with the energy efficiency goals that the Congress has set. We have no disagreement there. But it doesn't do us much good to save $2 on the electric bill if it's going to cost us many thousands of dollars to buy the new appliance or buy the new generation facility. In our view, we've not done low-income families much justice in that case. So we want to balance the equation very appropriately, and I would look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And a big old Texas welcome to a friend, Energy Secretary Dan Brouillette. Dan, I'm so sorry we missed each other last week at the SPR there in Texas. I suspect you're even more sorry because you get to relive the Gulf Coast heat of summer. No Thibodeau, no Boudreaux, no sucking crawfish heads like you did with Mr. Tozan. So let's make that date again sometime in the future. I have one question for you, Dan. It's not about COVID-19. It's about a local issue. I want to ask about the disposal of Americium 241. It's a byproduct of weapons-grade plutonium production. It's used for smoke detectors and downhole oil well logging. It's very radioactive and cancer-causing. America stopped producing this product in 2005, despite the fact that we still had domestic demand. And so for 15 years, we've been importing this product. In 2015, my hometown of Sugar Land had a little bout with this product. A small spill that released some cesium-137 and Americium 241, half a mile from my son's high school in Sugar Land, Texas. But since this radioactive isotope came from a foreign source, we can't store this, Dan, in the WIPP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. So there it sits, a national security risk and an environmental risk if it spills. So I have 3 questions for you about this issue. Number 1, can you assess the risk of letting this sit all across the country? Number 2, can the WIPP handle all this isotope we have in America? And do you support my bill to give your department more authority over getting this stuff out and stored in the WIPP?
Mr. Olson, it's great to see you again, and I am sorry I missed you last week. It was great to be back in my adopted home of Texas, and it was pretty hot down there, but it was fantastic to be home. I hope that we can get together again very soon down in Texas or elsewhere. But with regard to your question on Americium, yes, I have not reviewed your bill in detail, but if it is to provide the authority for us to receive this Americium and store it in WIPP, it would be something that I think we would probably support. I'd like to take a close look at it. I am familiar with the situation that you face down in Sugar Land, and you've identified the problem for us is that we don't know the source of that particular product, and we're prohibited by law as a result from accepting it into the WIPP facility in New Mexico. But perhaps through legislative changes or perhaps some other process, we can move forward to accept that material and put it into the WIPP facility. It's very important that we remove this from the communities. And your community is not unique in that sense. I mean, there are many communities across Texas, as well as other parts of the United States, where these sources, it's known as a source, are still sitting, in some cases, in strip malls without much security. So it's very, very important that we remove this product and store it safely.
Can the WIPP handle these products, Dan? Does it have the capability to handle all these products? Or is that just, I've heard it's overfilling. I think that's red herring. We confirm that? You got the room to store this waste?
I would have to double check on the room. I'm assuming we do, but we certainly have the technical capability of storing Americium, yes.
And one final question, and Dan, this is about the Federal Reserve's Main Street Lending Program. This program is essential to for mid-sized people involved in oil and gas operations. They have to have this money coming through because they're getting hammered by COVID and this pricing war going on between Saudi Arabia and Russia. So can you talk about how important this project is, this program is for the suppliers of energy, the midstream guys in particular, and how this should be open to them as well?
Sure. I've worked closely with Secretary Mnuchin to ensure that all of the programs that under all of your leadership you passed and made available to American businesses, including the energy business. I've had many conversations with the midstream producers, the independent producers out in the Permian Basin of Texas. Some of them have availed themselves to these programs, and I think it's important that we continue that good work. We're in a unique situation here with this pandemic. You know, Texas has long experienced boom and bust cycles in the oil business. You know how to handle that very, very well. But we've never experienced a situation in which we had a market event like what happened in Saudi Arabia and Russia under the auspices of OPEC, combined with a lack of demand that was, you know, generated by this pandemic, and, you know, with economies around the world appropriately closing or slowing down. We've never seen that before in U.S. history. We've never seen it in the oil business. So it presents a unique challenge. But I'm fully supportive of what the Congress did to make these programs available to not only all American businesses, but in particular the energy businesses as well.
Thank you, soldier. I'm a sailor. Join me in saying, go Navy, go Army, beat Air Force.
Go Army.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Taco, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Quite well.
Yes, well, great. Thank you. Secretary Brouillette, welcome back to the Energy and Commerce Committee. Mr. Secretary, the administration's budget request once again has zeroed out funding for the Weatherization Assistance Program, a critical program that we know is there to support the health and safety and energy efficiency of low-income Americans as they maintain their homes. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we know more people are unemployed and staying at home. We also know that state budgets have realized great shortfalls. Given these conditions, do you see some additional value in federal weatherization dollars that could be used once economies reopened and retrofits can resume safely?
Sure, I do. And thank you for your conversation yesterday. I appreciated the opportunity to trade some notes on some of these important programs. And I appreciate the concern that you have about the president's budget with regard to the weatherization program in particular. I think it's important for us to remind ourselves from time to time, though, that, you know, what we do at the DOE is we look all across the enterprise. And we just talked about energy efficiency, and that's a very important component of the weatherization program. We have what's called cross-cutting programs, where we take money not only from ERE, but we use it, we take money from the science labs and other places where we can develop technologies that are ultimately put into the marketplace that will increase efficiency. So while you may see a reduction in the actual weatherization program, I want to assure you that the work on energy efficiency is broad-based. It's not just one bucket or one line item in a budget that reflects the commitment to energy efficiency. So with regard to COVID and efficiency, we have taken some initial steps and extended some of the grant programs until we can do some more analysis, but you know, to make it just more available to people who are utilizing the program. I think what we've done is appropriate, and you know, I'd be more than happy to come up and spend more time with you and go through the exact steps that we've taken so far.
Good, thank you. We're certainly going to be quite active on behalf of our households that require the weatherization program. I also want to focus on the role DOE can play in reducing costs to encourage deployment of existing energy technologies. For example, DOE has identified inconsistent permitting requirements and processes as a significant cost of residential energy installations. The patchwork of permitting requirements across thousands of local jurisdictions causes unnecessary delays and certainly adds administrative costs. This not only increases energy prices for our consumers, but also stifles homeowner and business investments in these technologies, such as rooftop solar. Other countries like Germany and Australia, as we all know, have sought ways to streamline permitting. The average cost of a residential solar installation in Australia is less than one-half the cost in the United States. So, Mr. Secretary, DOE and NREL have worked on reducing these permitting costs. Do you believe DOE or another federal entity can continue to play a role in helping to streamline the permitting process for residential energy systems?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think, the challenges I hear, have to do with not only solar, but also offshore wind, for instance. We've seen some challenges with permitting some of the facilities, both on the East and West Coast. And I think it's, look, it's very important that we have community involvement in the permitting process. And I'm not suggesting for a second that we deny individuals or communities an opportunity to be a part of a permitting process. But we should look very closely to see if there are certain redundancies or certain things in the process that are not conducive or not constructive or not allowing the process to move forward in a forthright and transparent way. And I'd be open to that type of conversation with you or your staff or anyone on the committee.
Thank you. Finally, I believe the Advanced Manufacturing Office is an incredible resource for our United States manufacturers to become more competitive and sustainable. The industrial sector is responsible for roughly 1/5 of greenhouse gas emission and consumes roughly 1/3 of the primary energy here in the United States. In recent years, Congress has taken a bigger interest in these challenges. The Clean Industrial Technology Act has bipartisan support, and this committee's climate legislation discussion draft has suggested creating a new DOE Assistant Secretary of Industry. I know other groups have called for reorganization of DOE to better reflect the challenges our nation faces. Do you have any thoughts, whether through reorganization of the department or otherwise, on the need to give greater emphasis and resources for DOE's manufacturing programs?
That's an interesting idea. I'd love to take a look at your bill and talk to you more about the organizational construct of DOE. The importance of advanced manufacturing cannot be understated, however, especially as we start to look at more of these energy efficient or the renewable technologies that are coming online. I did have an opportunity to talk to Representative Kennedy, for instance, about some of the manufacturing processes and some of the things that he would like to bring to his congressional district. We are going to focus on the funding opportunities that we have at the Department of Energy. We just released approximately $44 million, give or take, over the course of the last few weeks, and it's focused almost exclusively on advanced manufacturing techniques and capabilities. It's a very important role for the DOE to play. Our Oak Ridge National Laboratory in particular has been a world leader in developing 3D printing as well as other technologies that allow advanced manufacturing to occur more efficiently. But with regard to your bill, I'll take a look at it, sir, and if I might reserve the right to perhaps respond to you in writing, I would be more than happy to do that.
Sure, we'd love to host you for a tour of what is happening in our district. So thank you, Mr. Secretary. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. McKinley of West Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, my friend, and for having this hearing. And welcome back, Mr. Secretary. Series of questions, if I could. Many of them are just yes and no. Under President Obama said, Chairman of his Joint Chief of Staff, General Dempsey, once said that, quote, improving our energy security improves our national security. So, do you agree with him?
Yes.
If gas-fired power plants provide nearly 40% of America's energy, do all gas-fired power plants get their natural gas from pipelines?
Yes, in America, pretty much.
Thank you, in America.
Yeah.
So now, and if 90% of our natural gas is transported by pipelines, is it fair to say, therefore, that pipelines are an essential part of our national security?
Yes.
Thank you. But the environmental left doesn't seem to agree with you. And they posted this headline the other day about delay wins the day. They want a delay. And what they're referring to are the delays that occurred over the loss that has occurred was the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was operational, as you know, for 3 years.
Sure.
The Atlantic Coast Pipeline that went through 17 permits, federal government, and 16 state permits. It even went to the Supreme Court and got approval with it. And now they're even challenging the Mountain Valley Pipeline that's transporting gas from West Virginia to other states. So my question would be, could the loss of these pipelines that we just mentioned, could they pose a challenge to our national security?
In my view, yes.
Okay.
I think...
and it appears that some of our governors, like Cuomo and Inslee, may be abusing their 401 permit, their authority. But because of Cuomo, states in the Northeast, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, have to get their electricity from Canada and their natural gas from Russia. So whose economy is Cuomo helping? It's certainly not, is it Putin's? It's certainly not ours. So if I could, Mr. Secretary, as you know, the administration is about to finalize a new NEPA reform, significant rewrite of NEPA. And it's my understanding that nothing in the reforms get rid of any existing rules, but rather you all have developed something that might streamline the permitting process, and primarily so that the environmental left can't weaponize the permitting process. Now let me switch gears just for a minute. The government has called on manufacturers to produce more PPE. Hundreds of millions more respirators, plastic face shields, gowns, gloves, all are going to be necessary. They're all produced from this. This is natural gas. This is resins from natural gas. Won't we need pipelines to produce more PPE?
Yes, sir, ultimately we will. And to address your national security concerns, at least with regard to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, you know, it begs the question. We have an enormous naval facility down at Norfolk. We have an enormous Army facility in North Carolina, the home of the 82nd Airborne. It's very important that these facilities have ready access, reliable access to electricity, because they depend upon the private grid for the purposes of their power generation.
I've got a couple more questions if I can slip in quickly.
Sure.
Wall Street, as you know, works on certainty. They depend on it. And the litigation and delays created by the environmental left have created the opposite, especially as it relates to what happened to coal. Are we about to see the same thing on Wall Street, developing concerns about pipelines and natural gas? Do you think there could be a threat?
Perhaps we are. The regulatory uncertainty will lead certain investors to back away from these types of projects.
So my last question, if 70% of our energy comes from fossil fuels, and if Wall Street stops financing gas-fired power plants and has an aversion to funding pipelines because they don't know whether they're going to be built or not because of the regulations, is this a positive or a negative sign for our national security?
In my view, it's a negative sign.
Thank you. So in the 6 seconds left, can you explain a little bit about maybe what DOE is doing to address this streamlining process and prevent the abuse?
Well, through the interagency process, we are contributing to the NEPA efforts, which I understand are going to be released very, very shortly. And to your point, they're not to reduce in any way, shape, or form the environmental concerns that the American people have raised. What we're simply doing is eliminating redundancies. I'll tell you really quickly, in the case of DOE, I made a decision very early that if another agency had conducted a NEPA analysis with regard to perhaps, say, an LNG export facility, which we have some regulatory responsibility for, that the DOE would rely upon the other NEPA analysis. FERC is quite capable, for instance, in conducting NEPA analysis. So if they've already done the work once, there's no need for DOE to do a second NEPA analysis. Eliminating that step will save an enormous amount of money for the applicants who are looking to build these export facilities for LNG. It's just one small example, but it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Loebsack for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rush and Ranking Member Upton, for holding this hearing today. And thank you, Secretary Brouillette, for testifying today as well. As you know, the RFS is a key economic driver in my home state of Iowa, and actually throughout farm country. And the biofuels industry has been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, the pandemic only exacerbated the pain that this industry had already been experiencing in no small measure due to the explosion of small refinery exemptions granted by this administration, which have wiped out over 4 billion gallons of biofuel from the marketplace since 2016. In January, as you know, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals found that in order for a small refinery to be eligible for an exemption, the law requires that that refinery have an exemption in place to extend, meaning that they must have received an exemption each year in order to be eligible for a future exemption. Unfortunately, rather than adhere to the ruling of the court, many small refineries have submitted retroactive waiver petitions dating as far back as 2011 in an attempt to fill in the gaps in years where they did not receive a waiver. According to EPA's own data, by the ruling of the 10th Circuit, there should be no more than 7 small refineries eligible for future exemptions. And yet EPA recently confirmed that it has received 52 so-called gap year small refinery petitions, which if granted would equate to a loss of an additional $2 billion of biofuel demand. So, Mr. Secretary, I have a series of questions here. I'm going to try to get through all of them. And if I cut you off, I apologize, but I want to get through as many, if not all of these, as I possibly can. The first question is, have those gap year petitions been scored by DOE and sent back to EPA? And if not, when will that happen?
Thank you, Mr. Lobsack. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for your conversation as well earlier this week by telephone. You know, I will get back to you on the 50-plus applications that may have come from EPA. I'm not quite sure where we are in the process. I'll just state that, there are differing legal opinions about this 10th Circuit case. I think some are reading it as an opportunity to file these gap applications, if you will. I'll also just, state for the record that if EPA sends us the application, we are required still to evaluate it. So I'm assuming that we're doing that today, and I'll get you a precise answer as to where we stand in that particular process.
I'm going to ask you for your opinion. Do you believe that the law does allow EPA to grant these gap year petitions?
I'm sorry, say again, sir?
Do you believe that the law allows EPA to grant these gap year petitions?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not quite certain about that. I'd have to review the case very closely, and I'm not an attorney, so I'd hate to give you a legal opinion.
Yeah, because my next question has to do with that, actually. Will DOE ensure its review of these petitions conforms with the court's decision?
If I understood you correctly, could you just say the last part of that again?
Yeah, I'll do the whole question. Will DOE ensure its review of these petitions conforms with the court's decision?
Oh, sure. No, we'll do everything according to the law and our understanding of the law. There's no question about that. I will get with Bill Cooper, as our general counsel at the Department of Energy, and we will ensure, whatever analysis we are required to conduct under the law, whatever we send to EPA is going to be fully compliant with not only the 10th Circuit decision, but also the federal statute.
And you may or may not be able to answer this next question, but has EPA sent you any exemption petitions from refiners who had previously submitted a petition for the exact same year, but were denied a waiver the first time around?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I will find out and get right back to you.
And do you know if DOE has changed its methodology or approach for scoring small refinery exemption petitions?
No, we've not. We conduct this analysis the same way we always have, and we provide our findings to EPA for their ultimate decision on the application.
Well, if it's not changed the methodology, then doesn't it stand to reason that DOE would have no choice but to score these do-over gap year petitions exactly the same way as the department did the first time?
Yes, sir. We've not changed our methodology. I mean, we have done this in the same manner in which we've done since the creation of the program back in 2005.
Okay. And other than the 52 gap year waiver petitions, EPA reports 27 waiver petitions pending for the 2019 RFS compliance year. Has DOE completed review of those petitions and made recommendations to EPA?
I will get you an answer on that, sir. I'd have to check the status of those applications.
Okay. Yeah, well, I look forward to the answers, and I did appreciate our conversation we had prior to this hearing. I appreciate what you're doing at the DOE, and I know you've got a lot of great history with the committee, and I appreciate that. But we got to make sure that we're doing the right thing for these biofuels folks, and we have to make sure that EPA and DOE are complying with this 10th Court Circuit decision, making sure that everyone's abiding by the law, and I know you agree with that as well. So thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, how are you this afternoon?
Hope you're the same.
All right. Oh, Mr. Secretary, one of my priorities, as we've discussed in the past, is research parity between the renewable research and our fossil fuel research. And as we look at the many issues that we're discussing today, including resiliency and the reliability of our power system, as well as the global environmental well-being, it's critical that we continue to invest in the research and development for fossil fuels as well as renewables. As you and I have discussed previously, of course, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, developing nations are using their coal supply, and they're going to use their coal supply. And one of the things I would hope that we would do is figure out how to use that the most effectively so that we can then move forward, not just in the United States, but globally to reduce emissions coming from coal-fired power plants and other fossil fuel burning plants. Do you agree that we should strive for parity and continue to invest in fossil research and development here in the United States?
There we go. Can you hear me, sir? To answer your question, yes, I do. I think we need to continue our research and development areas like CCUS for the purposes of making coal not only more efficient but cleaner. Because as you point out, developing nations will continue to use this very important resource that they have all around the world. Our own EIA, the Energy Information Administration, projects that the use of fossil fuels will continue at very high levels well into the 2040s, perhaps even out as far as 2050. And if that's the case, then I think we have an obligation to develop the technologies that are necessary to use those fuels very, very, very cleanly. So things like CCUS, R&D work at the Department of Energy, related to carbon capture and utilization, sequestration, are very, very important. And I think we should continue that work. And if it's, if it's the direction of Congress to increase that work, that type of work, which I would hope it would be, we would certainly welcome that opportunity.
Well, and I appreciate that, and of course I'm excited about some of the things that are happening here in my district, which is a coal producing and natural gas producing area. We have MOVA Technologies out of the New River Valley that is doing some flatbed technology where they run the gases through various substrates. And this is a very crude analogy, but they're running it through the substrates and it pulls out individual pollutants so that you don't have an issue with a series of things that have to be done afterwards. They can actually be sold commercially. I also think that the chemical looping still has great promise. And then, anything that we can do to find additional uses for coal products as we move forward. Is there anything in particular that you've looked at that you find to be an interesting and exciting new technology?
Yes, actually, I was just up in the western part of Pennsylvania visiting a coal facility there, and I saw technologies that, to me, were absolutely fascinating. Going back to your first question, though, and the use of coal, I want to point out that I think it's also important because we have enormous reserves here, and obviously your district is a big part of that in the United States. The export opportunities for coal are enormous around the world, and that means jobs here in the United States. So I would hate for us to close off that opportunity for the use of this product because it creates so many jobs, not only in Virginia, but also West Virginia and out in Wyoming as well. Many, many states produce coal. So my point is that let's continue the clean technologies that we need to make this product cleaner as we export it around the world. But with regard to the new uses for coal, we are now extracting some critical minerals. We are beginning to figure out how to extract rare earth elements, which are absolutely vital for the development of battery technologies. So as we look to the future and perhaps see more and more use of renewable energies, and we try and reach that holy grail of grid-scale battery storage, it's going to be perhaps our knowledge and perhaps the research that we do today on coal that might allow us to break some of the supply chain restrictions and vulnerabilities that we're currently experiencing today. China, as you perhaps know, I think from our conversations, you well know this, is that China today owns about 80% of the rare earth element market. So we're incredibly dependent upon, as I pointed out earlier, an adversarial nation to the United States. If we can develop these products from coal, we've strengthened not only our energy security, but our national security as well.
And I appreciate that, and they're doing work. Dr. Yoon at Virginia Tech is doing work on that as well. So there's a lot of new technology out there, and I appreciate your leadership on those issues. And Mr. Chairman, I see my time is up, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's terrific to see you. Sorry we're not all there with you. I wanted to ask you questions in two areas. One is the energy and water efficiency audits. And then second, staffing levels in the Department of Energy that are essential for us to pursue energy efficiency. First of all, on the energy audits, my understanding is your report shows that only 43% of the federal agencies have actually completed their audits, and only 6 out of 28 have done it fully. And as we all know, there is immense opportunity for savings through energy efficiency. And there's $7.8 billion of efficiency measures that have been identified, which would result, as it's according to a report, $800 million in financial savings. What are the obstacles? What is the problem with getting these energy and water audits done? Can you speak to that?
I'm sure there are many reasons why they're not being done, sir, but what I'll do is I will go back and I will ask for my own independent audit and get an update for you so that I can figure out exactly why this is not getting done in the manner in which I know that you want it done and I know the committee wants it done. We have a tremendous opportunity here, as you point out. I mean, I'm looking at some of the data here in front of me, especially with regard to the federal facilities. We are looking at roughly the savings to the government, according to the data that I have here, they're in the billions of dollars. It's enormous. Right. So I think we ought to proceed at a very aggressive rate. I will commit to you here publicly that I will get back to you very, very shortly with an update on those audits.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, and I think there's a lot of bipartisan support on our committee for these audits and the savings we can get. And let me just state candidly, my sense about the failure of this to have happened before is that it reflects a slow walk approach towards getting this done. So I really will appreciate you getting back to us. But I think all of us will really appreciate getting the audits done. So when you get back with your report, the question is not so much why they aren't getting done, but when will they be done? Does that sound fair?
Sounds very fair, and I will commit to you here that we will get you an answer within the next, I'll just say, would 10 days be appropriate for you?
It would be great. No, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Also, there's this question of staffing. You know, as an example, again, on energy efficiency, Mr. McKinley and I for years have been working on the Hope for Homes Act, which would allow homeowners to do installations for energy efficiency, get some help from the government, and it has the real benefit of putting local contractors to work. This won't work, even if we're successful, as we think we will be in getting the money, unless there is staffing in the appropriate departments in the Department of Energy for energy efficiency. And our sense is that, or actually our information is that we've been very slow to fill the positions that are available. Can you speak to that and what steps will be taken to fully staff up? And that's in anticipation that we're actually going to be moving forward on energy efficiency.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to address that. That issue was raised in another hearing. It came to my attention very recently. And, you know, I'm not happy with the answers I received, but there were some initial delays with things as simple as badging of employees. It would take an enormous amount of time just to get people through the employment process and provide them with a badge to do the work that we were attempting to hire them to do. And as a result, you know, people have these very specialized skills, very technical skills. In many cases, they were taking jobs or other jobs that were available to them at the moment. We simply lost out on the competition. It's disheartening and disappointing, and we've taken steps to address very simple measures like that. I can also get you an update on the staffing that we've done since that hearing and since that last conversation with Assistant Secretary Dan Simmons, who was here before the committee.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you this afternoon. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to brief us on your department's important activities around this COVID-19 pandemic. You know, you and your team at DOE have done some tremendously helpful work, work that has benefited all Americans. I commend you for your work filling the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to the brim, securing the electrical grid, and as you noted in your testimony, for utilizing some of DOE's most advanced world-class laboratories and supercomputers in the fight against COVID-19. COVID-19, there is no question, and its associated economic challenges has put America on its heels, and our adversaries are looking to exploit this crisis. So it's critically important that we, as members of this subcommittee, don't lose focus on maintaining our global energy leadership. My time's limited, so I want to get right into my questions. As you know very well, Mr. Secretary, my district in eastern and southeastern Ohio is blessed with an abundant supply of oil and gas in the Marcellus and Utica shales. This is an economic lifeline to my constituents. And not only that, but this cheap and abundant resource, if it's able to be efficiently transported and brought to market, for example, in the form of liquefied natural gas, it enables America to project power and push back on adversaries like Russia and Iran. As lawmakers, we need to focus on cutting unnecessary Washington red tape and burdensome regulations. This is why I recently introduced the Unlocking Our Domestic LNG Potential Act to do just that. So, 2 questions in one here. Can you explain, Mr. Secretary, in your dealings and negotiations on the global stage, why it's so important for us to maintain a strong domestic energy sector here at home, and what benefits do Americans see from exporting some of our excess energy resources, such as LNG, in the global marketplace?
Yes, sir, I'm happy to. I'll just give you the latest example of the importance of having a very strong and diverse energy sector here in the United States. We mentioned earlier the conversations that were occurring and, frankly, the dispute that occurred between Saudi Arabia and Russia just recently in the OPEC Plus conversation. The president directed me as soon as we saw that there was a dispute, and importantly, when we saw the reaction of one of the parties to that dispute, and the reaction was very plain. They both increased their production and lowered the price, which we feel was intended perhaps toward Russia, but the impact was felt here in the United States. The president immediately engaged and said, reach out to your counterparts, work this out, figure out what's going on. It became pretty clear in that conversation that it was not going to get resolved at the ministerial level, my level, with my counterpart. It got elevated to a head of state level. When the president engaged, he did so with a position of strength that was not available to presidents, you know, when I was growing up as a young kid in Louisiana. When we were an importing nation, not an exporting nation, we didn't have the authority, we didn't have the positioning in the world marketplace that would have allowed a president then to do what this president did, and that was to bring these parties together and resolve this dispute immediately, which brought stability to the world energy markets and the world oil markets. It's that ability to provide leadership in a foreign policy context that makes us understand why is it important that we have this energy industry.
And I agree with you 100%. And another corollary to that is commercial nuclear energy and our commercial nuclear entrepreneurs. We've got to win that battle with the Chinese and the Russians as well. Under your leadership, DOE has launched a variety of new initiatives, including the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, to accelerate the commercialization of new designs that are cheaper and smaller with additional safety benefits. And I was proud to reintroduce the Strengthening American Nuclear Competitiveness Act to help streamline the effort or the export of U.S. civilian nuclear technologies. So how does your work to formulate more bilateral nuclear cooperation agreements, recent International Development Finance Corporation action to repeal its limitation on nuclear deals, and legislative Part 810 reforms that I've proposed, how does that fit all together to position American nuclear entrepreneurs to seize this immense global economic opportunity, and why is it important for us?
Sure. Well, in a nutshell, sir, it's very important for us to export U.S. nuclear technology around the world because it comes with it, as you point out, certain restrictions, things like 123 restrictions. Section 123 is part of the U.S. code that restricts the use of nuclear fuels for the purposes of developing warheads. So a very important non-proliferation aspect to the export of U.S. Nuclear technologies. China and Russia doesn't recognize that. They don't have those types of restrictions. So to the extent that countries want to buy those technologies, we also accept the risk that they may develop a warhead. So it's very, very important to our national security that we export U.S. nuclear technology. You mentioned the other things that we're doing in our national laboratories. We're moving forward with things like the Advanced Test Reactor, which allow us to develop not only the reactor technologies, but also the materials that are needed to build these reactors and the nuclear components. If we can do that with the Advanced Test Reactor, if we can develop potentially under the auspices of the laws that were passed recently, a versatile test reactor, if Congress chooses to fund that, we can test materials that make the U.S. technologies even cheaper and more competitive on the world market. And as we do that, again, we create economic opportunity here. We create national security because those technologies will come with it, the non-proliferation safeguards that the U.S. law requires.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thanks for indulging. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kennedy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you, and thank you for being here. I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak directly with you about an issue that I believe this country must make a priority. It's not going to be a surprise to anybody in this committee, offshore wind development. As members of the committee well know, this has been a priority of mine since I first arrived in Congress. I've had the opportunity to discuss this issue with a few of your predecessors, Mr. Secretary, and I look forward to this conversation as well. The research, development, and critically, the deployment of offshore wind in the United States holds immense promise. From the clear climate benefits of utilizing abundant, renewable natural resource to the economic impact on ratepayers, to the benefits are undeniable. In New England, and in Massachusetts in particular, we pay amongst the highest retail electric rates in the lower 48 states. Taking advantage of a renewable natural resource that we have right off the coast makes perfect sense. In March of 2020, but beyond the climate and economic benefits, the promise of offshore wind is the growth and incubation of an entire new industry. It includes direct and indirect jobs, many of which will require high-skilled American union labor and to realize its immense potential. In March of 2020, the American Wind Energy Association released its U.S. offshore wind power economic impact assessment. Among the findings, we estimated that, quote, developing 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind along the East Coast could support up to 83,000 jobs and deliver $25 billion in annual economic output by 2030. And that's just the potential on the East Coast. As you know, the federal government is currently evaluating proposals off the coast of Massachusetts. So my first question, Mr. Secretary, is How is DOE coordinating with other federal agencies, including the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, to address the jurisdictional issues surrounding offshore wind?
Thank you, sir. I appreciated the opportunity as well to catch up with you by telephone over the weekend. Enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to working with you. You know, we work closely with EPA, the Department of Interior in certain cases, if it's dealing with offshore wind, to ensure that the permitting processes are streamlined. We mentioned earlier our NEPA efforts and other things that we're working on. We're going to continue that effort. Because we do recognize that, you know, the provision of wind energy, the provision of solar energy, the provision of nuclear energy, the provision of, you know, other forms of energy, hydro, are key to our energy diversity here in the United States. And as we talked about earlier with regard to national security, it's that diversity that allows us the strength that we need in America to continue growing the economy at the pace at which we're going to grow it. I'm very supportive of your efforts that are locally. I'm happy to help you in any way that I might be able to.
I appreciate that, sir. So building off that, I want to get a sense of what DOE is doing to ensure that offshore wind can not only connect to the grid, but then get that grid to power a load center, given the permitting issues that you had discussed.
Sure. We need to continue to develop infrastructure here in the United States, transmission infrastructure, distribution infrastructure, so that we can get the power where it needs to be. You know, we have unique challenges here in the United States with the provision of renewable energy. If you think about it, it becomes very logical. There's lots of sunshine in places like Arizona and New Mexico in the southwest part of the country. Getting that electrical power to perhaps Chicago or high-density areas in the United States can be a bit of a challenge. And you know, while we are very sensitive to the ability of local communities and states to be a part of the regulatory process or the permitting process, I should say, it's also important that we find a path forward to develop the infrastructure that we need to move the power from where it's generated to where it needs to be. And it's an ongoing effort, not only of the Department of Energy, but the EPA, Department of Interior, other bodies, state and local institutions as well. And it's been a very robust conversation, and I look forward to being an even larger part of it.
And Mr. Secretary, just as my time is running a bit short here, I wanted to flag that you and I had discussed previously about taking advantage of the potential of offshore wind development in the Northeast and the economic impact that this would have along the East Coast and in particularly southeastern Massachusetts, about a center of excellence on offshore wind. I sent a letter to the Assistant Secretary of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy a few weeks ago, and would love to get a response and keep in contact with your agency to figure out what we can do to make that come about.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I will certainly follow up with Dan Simmons and get you some additional information, but I'd also like to get together with you, and I'd also, if I might, sir, take this opportunity to invite you to our National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. I think you'd be pleased with that particular center of excellence. That is one of its focal points.
I look forward to it, sir. Thanks very much, Mr. Secretary.
Your chair now recognizes Mr. Bouchard of Indiana for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary. I'd like to focus on grid reliability and resilience. Some of this has already been discussed, but you know, the COVID-19 impact has made it even more front and center. And as you know, a key principle to a resilient grid is the need for a diverse fuel and generation supply for the electrical sector. And I'm a supporter of the all of the above energy approach, and I believe each fuel mix plays a key role in our grid, especially during a public health emergency. However, it's important that we don't forget the critical role baseload energy such as coal and natural gas play to our grid reliability. And it's more important than ever that our grid has a reliable backbone to make sure the lights always stay on and our frontline workers have the electricity they need. I want to applaud the DOE at remaining committed to clean coal in our energy mix, as you've discussed earlier during the hearing, and by you recently announcing the Coal First initiative, which will work to make coal plants flexible, innovative, resilient, small, and transformative, with the goal of one day having these plants be emission-free. In Southwest Indiana that I represent, we have all the coal in the state of Indiana. Our state at one point had about 85% of its power from coal. It's now quite a bit less, but still substantial based on our expansion of renewable energy sources. But a couple of questions I have. Can you explain maybe what, if any, lessons you learned and continuing to learn during the COVID-19 pandemic that can help ensure our grid remains reliable and resilient?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I mean, you know, it is the most, I think, striking example, obvious example is the importance of electricity to everything we do. I mean, if we take a step back and just imagine for a moment the horror that would result from a loss of power in, say, New York City or one of our major cities where the pandemic was particularly acute, at least in the early stages. The loss of power there would just be devastating. Our ability to replace the power is somewhat limited. I mean, some of these folks have backup generators and whatnot, but those are very short in nature. So just the importance of the electricity grid is just, you know, first and foremost, and it forced us to recognize, you know, as I mentioned to Mr. Kennedy and others, the need for additional infrastructure here in the United States, the additional emphasis that we placed on cyber security throughout this pandemic, because if you were an adversary, you would look at this as potentially an opportunity to do some damage to the grid and to the American economy. So our vigilance has been raised as a result of this pandemic. Sir, to your question about clean coal and the announcements that we made with Coal First, I think that's a fascinating program at the Department of Energy. It's designed to bring the next generation of coal generation to market. The facilities that we're looking at are smaller, they're much more efficient, and importantly, when they're combined with things like biomass, the technologies that are available to us in the Coal First actually have the ability to have a net negative carbon emissions footprint. So it's a fascinating technology that we want to continue to work on and develop and potentially see move into the private sector at some point in the future. So thank you for your interest in the program, and I look forward to keeping you updated on it.
Well, thank you. And again, thanks to what the Department of Energy is doing in the research realm. And I want to reiterate what other members have said, and I think you have said during this hearing, is that it is important that we don't limit ourselves to research and development in only one area of energy generation. And I think, you know, there's a push right now to forget about coal, forget about natural gas and other fossil fuels, whereas with innovative research and development, this can be a substantial contributor as far as our lifetimes and probably into the future, and also be a major contributor to making sure that we have a more reliable and resilient grid that will help protect us, as you mentioned, on the national security front, but more importantly, improve the lives of the citizens that we represent. So thanks for your work, and continue the good work you're doing more broadly across the energy space. And I hope that the Congress continues to support that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer, for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I'm having a little difficulty with my computer, just trying to get to my remarks. Oh, well. I wanted to ask a question today about the responding to COVID-19 and the economic recovery from COVID-19, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us. It's important for Americans to see that their government is doing everything in their power to help keep them safe. And I know from our discussion yesterday that the Department of Energy has been helpful in combating COVID-19 directly. And I think my constituents would be pleased to hear how the Department of Energy is leveraging the full range of its facilities in the fight against this terrible disease that's been so disruptive in our country. So how are researchers at the Department of Energy using the massive computing power at their disposal to help us understand COVID-19 and explore potential treatments? And how might this research help us get this pandemic under control?
Sure, I'm happy to address that. The national laboratories have been front and center on some of the early findings with regard to COVID. So for instance, at Argonne National Laboratory, they use very high-powered light beams and light sources and X-ray technologies. And what they were able to do is identify certain protein strains that would further lead to potential drug compounds that would have positive impacts on this particular virus, this COVID-19. They were able to do that because of the supercomputing capacities at Argonne and Oak Ridge and some other national laboratories in very, very short amounts of time. So, the very, practical or, for myself, a layman's way of understanding it, rather than taking a year or two to go through perhaps billions of pages of academic research to find the most relevant articles, they could do that in a day or perhaps 2 days by using the speed of the computers to sift through it. The same thing with drug compounds. They were able to look through several thousand, perhaps even more drug compounds to find the first 70 or 77 or so that they could identify as having a potential positive impact on this virus. So it's using that ability that allowed the CDC, allowed the researchers and the doctors at HHS and other interagency partners to make those key first decisions and potentially limit the impact of this pandemic.
So I want to direct my comments to the disruption that's been caused by COVID-19. You and I discussed yesterday the opportunity to build back better than before. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the dramatic advancements that have been made in increasing solar and wind energy production and how we can envision a role for renewable energy that will place our economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and keep us moving forward so that we can not only rebuild our economy, but come back stronger with jobs here in America.
Thank you for the conversation yesterday. I really enjoyed that. With regard to the future of some of these renewable technologies, I do think we have an opportunity in America, not only as a result of the pandemic, but I think just as a result of the changing consumer desires to develop some advanced technologies, for instance, the solar world in which we had discussed yesterday, and I may have mentioned in the earlier part of this hearing. We at the DOE, we look at photovoltaics as somewhat antiquated. It's a very mature technology. If you want a solar panel, you can usually get one in America. You can usually get it installed in your house very, very quickly. I know that there's been some slowdown as a result of the pandemic, but nonetheless, the technology is available to most U.S. consumers or world consumers. What we're looking at is the next generation of solar technology, the use of perovskites, the use of other materials that perhaps are organic here in the United States or around the world, or they may be man-made technologies or man-made materials that we use to make the next generation of solar panels. If we can unlock that, if we can move forward with that type of technology and more importantly, get it to the marketplace through either our Office of Technology Transition or other methodologies to get it to the marketplace, then we have an enormous economic opportunity ahead of us. And, with regard to our support here at the DOE, we support all forms of energy. We will continue to do so because, as I mentioned earlier, we feel very strongly that adds not only to our economic and energy security, but our national security as well.
Thank you very much. My time is up. I did have a question on negative emission technology and direct air capture, but I'll submit that for the record. Thank you. And I yield back.
The young lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes. Mr. Flores, please unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Secretary Brouillette. It's great to have you testifying again to us today. Just want to let you know it's 100 degrees here in my part of Texas, and my solar system is producing 100% of my energy needs. So doing my part for the grid and also for the emissions of the country. Mr. Secretary, as you know, we've talked quite a bit today about maintaining national security and maintaining U.S. Energy dominance, and that those are key inputs for continued economic opportunity for hardworking Americans. And as you pointed out in one of your earlier responses, we need to aggressively support innovation and private sector partnerships, particularly when it comes to the use and development of advanced nuclear reactors to regain our global leadership role when it comes to nuclear energy. You also mentioned the critical need to make sure that high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HALEU as we all call it, is available in sufficient quantities. You did say earlier that the Department of Energy is working on trying to make this fuel source available. Can you give us a little bit more detail, a little bit more substance about what the Energy Department is doing so that we can regain that leadership role in the nuclear space? And then also, if you think there is additional legislative support that's needed, let us share that information as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flores. Keep that AC on. It gets really hot. It gets really hot down there. It was great to be in Texas last week. I'm sorry I missed you. With regard to the HALEU project that you're talking about, what we have instituted is a pilot project. We're going to do this at Portsmouth, Ohio, where we had an existing facility, so we didn't need to construct new facilities to do this. Our intent is to spend about $115 million that was appropriated by the U.S. Congress to take some centrifuges that we had down in Oak Ridge, move them to Ohio, and create this high-assay LEU, which is enriched to a range somewhere around 19%. We hope that this will catalyze, and that project's underway. The casings have moved to Ohio. We have some additional construction to do inside of the facility, but we hope to have this completed by sometime midpoint next year, perhaps at the end of next year, and begin producing in limited quantities this particular fuel source. We are also, at the same time, using our Idaho National Laboratory to move forward with some research and development and potentially some more aggressive work, actually deployment of a small modular reactor, which doesn't use this type of fuel, but is nonetheless a newer technology that we'd like to see come to market soon. With regard to the HALEU fuel that I mentioned earlier, what will we use that for is an advanced or a micro reactor, and INL is at the tip of the spear for us in the development of that technology as well. So we're going to work closely with them. We're going to work closely with the U.S. Department of Defense, who has indicated an interest in these small nuclear reactors for perhaps some deployment to remote locations where radar stations are located around the world, and quite candidly, they don't have access to energy sources as we do in the lower 48, perhaps. I'm thinking about Alaska, places like the Aleutian Islands. So we're moving very aggressively to move this technology out to the marketplace.
Okay, very good. And as you know, my HALEU bill has passed the House, not only in the last Congress, but also in this Congress, and it helps give you the statutory authority you need for the development and transportation of this fuel by setting up public-private partnerships. We're hoping the Senate will act soon. What other legislative support do you need to help us regain our dominance in this area?
Well, that bill is very important. So thank you for your leadership there, and thank you for your support of both the technology as well as the program within DOE. I look forward to supporting that all throughout the process. With regard to other legislative authorities, at this point in time, I don't have anything for you in terms of a specific need, but I'm happy to discuss this with you further and look through our legal authorities and see if there might be anything that might present a roadblock to us in the future for the development of this type of fuel or the advanced nuclear technologies that we just discussed.
Okay, and thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your answers to my questions, and let me know when INL is open up for congressional visitors again, because that's on my wish list of places to visit. Thank you.
Love to have you. We would love to have you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman lady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for convening us, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for spending part of your day with us. I wanted to ask you about the Department of Energy envisioning creating jobs through modernization and all kind of jobs, whether you have a high school diploma or you have your master's. What are you thinking about that?
What am I thinking about in terms of the economic development or the?
What will be opportunities?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite that. I apologize.
No, that's okay. How is DOE envisioning creating jobs through grid modernization, whether it's if you just have a high school diploma or if you have a master's degree, what type of jobs are available?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite catch the first part of your question. You know, at the DOE, what we are very interested in doing is creating opportunities not only for scientists. You know, the vast bulk of the population, the workforce at DOE, including our contractor base, are, you know, PhD level scientists. They're nuclear engineers, nuclear physicists, other types of scientists throughout our laboratory system. What we need to do, though, is perhaps be more aggressive in developing the pipeline for that sort of talent. And what we're now focused on is the development of programs, internships, fellowships, that would be used by even high school seniors or high school juniors in some cases to come and spend a summer with us, come and spend a few weeks with us, and let us show you what it is that we do. And through that process, perhaps generate some interest in STEM education curriculums that perhaps would lead to these students coming back to us as perhaps postdocs 10 years later. So we're very aggressively pursuing that. We're also looking for opportunities to partner with private industry as well, because we don't pretend to have a monopoly on the development of talent here in America at the Department of Energy, although I think we do a pretty good job of it. We do want to partner with our colleagues in private industry and work with them to develop STEM curricula in certain cases, and importantly, to just develop the opportunity for students to come in at a very early age and see what it is we do.
That's wonderful, and I hope when you're thinking of that you think about a diverse pipeline also. And then I wanted to move to empty buildings and working with our cities and towns to think about reconfiguration of existing buildings so they're healthier, they incorporate more touchless technique, create better air ventilation and spacing. So what do you recommend to cities and towns I guess just to have healthier buildings, more green buildings?
So, as we discussed earlier, I mean, focusing on efficiency, focusing on the programs that we have. You know, we have the federal energy program, FEMP as it's known, for federal buildings. But focusing on energy efficiency and what we might do to improve the efficiency of some of these buildings is clearly important. But I might add that, you know, this is going to be a much larger issue for us perhaps in the next few months or perhaps years as we, you know, address the changes in society as a result of this pandemic. I've talked to several colleagues in private industry who have already indicated to me that perhaps telework may be the future for many of the employees at their respective companies. If that's the case, we're going to have some additional space available in these buildings all around, including in the small communities that you mentioned earlier.
If you, I don't know if you know the answer, but if you were to give, I know there's not one grade, A through F, but how do you feel like our towns and cities are doing as far as greener, cleaner, more technically sound buildings? Do you feel like we have lots and lots of work to do, or we're halfway there?
I don't know with regard to specific buildings or towns. I couldn't provide that kind of grade. I will provide a pretty high grade, though, for the development of the technologies that are leading us to more efficient use of energy all across the country. What private industry is doing, I think, is absolutely remarkable. As we mentioned earlier in this hearing, what our scientists are doing in our national laboratories, the development of new solar technologies, the development of new technologies that allow us to capture carbon in certain instances, not only from fuels like coal, but perhaps even natural gas and others. I give them very, very high marks for the work that's being done there.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for joining us, and I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Berrigan, for 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, am I up?
Mr. Hudson from North Carolina, sir. I'm sorry, the chair recognizes Mr. Hudson for 5 minutes. Mr. Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here with us today. I also want to just thank you and President Trump for your incredible leadership on behalf of our energy sector during this most trying time for our country. As you know, I represent the amazing men and women of Fort Bragg in North Carolina. These include the nation's immediate response force, the 82nd Airborne, our Army Special Forces, and other critical military components. As we face threats around the globe, it's of paramount importance our bases at home and our forward and remote operating bases have the sustainable energy supply they need to keep us safe. You and President Trump have made this a priority, and for that, I'm very grateful. As this committee and your department develop new energy technologies to adequately supply our armed forces, I believe the future of our defense energy supply and our focus should reside with small modular and advanced nuclear reactors. In fact, back in 2018, I had an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that requires the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense to develop guidelines for a pilot program, the development of micro-reactors at critical DOE and DOD sites. I'm very interested in this report's recommendations for our forward operating bases and for increasing energy resilience at bases like Fort Bragg. But unfortunately, the report's still at OMB, so I would appreciate anything you can do to assist me in getting this report finalized so we can move it forward. Just to get to my questions, build a little bit on what Mr. Flores was asking about. There was a recent report from the Nuclear Fuel Working Group, which outlined how America can reestablish itself as a global leader in nuclear technologies. This report supported next generation nuclear reactors. Can you comment on this report and some of your work on small modular and advanced nuclear reactors?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, sir, and thank you as well for the conversation that we had recently on the telephone. I appreciated learning more about your congressional district, and I might also, I'm a little bit envious of your representation of Fort Bragg. As a former Army tank commander and drill sergeant, I spent a little time down in North Carolina, and I miss my days there. So thank you for your service, and thank you for your representation of that important Army installation. With regard to your question about the Nuclear Fuels Working Group, what we had discussed earlier, I think is very important for the future of nuclear energy, not only here in the United States, but around the world. As I mentioned earlier, one of the earlier questions, we've lost our leadership in America on nuclear power. We're losing it very quickly to places like China and Russia. In the case of China, they're using technologies that I think can be fairly characterized as American technology. Westinghouse is perhaps the world's leader in the development of advanced nuclear technologies. They created a reactor. It's called the AP1000. It's a fantastic product. China developed a reactor that looks awfully similar, and we're seeing them deploy that around the world. And importantly, as I mentioned earlier, they deployed around the world without the safeguards, without the non-proliferation safeguards that we as Americans feel is very, very important. To the extent that we don't focus on that, we only increase our defense needs around the world. You know, if we allow rogue nations to develop this technology and from that develop warhead programs, we only increase our need for a strong defense here in the United States. So it's very, very important that we connect these things together in a way that allows us to move forward and perhaps regain our leadership in this nuclear area. The working group is the first step of that. We have many steps to go, but we do feel it is a very credible strategy that lays out a roadmap for America to retain or regain our leadership in this case in the nuclear space.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that work's very important, and I appreciate your leadership. But as you know, in order to effectively run an advanced reactor, you must have the necessary fuel. This committee's done work on advanced fuels. Mr. Flores and Mr. McNerney as Mr. Flores mentioned right before me, on high assay, low enriched uranium fuels. But can you talk about what DOE is doing to help with accident tolerant fuels, which are critical for existing and for these advanced reactors?
Sure, absolutely. The accident tolerant fuels are absolutely necessary in my view, not only for the development of the advanced reactors and the smaller reactors that we talked about earlier. It's important as well for changing the public perception about nuclear power in the first instance. We are still dealing with the overhang in America of things like 3 Mile Island. We obviously are dealing with the overhang of international events like Chernobyl and Fukushima. We all know about those horrible accidents. If we can develop a fuel that allows us to develop a technology that in certain cases you can turn the cooling off to the reactor and nothing happens. It simply shuts down. It is completely accident tolerant. That's important to changing that public perception and perhaps will increase public acceptance of this important energy source. As I mentioned earlier as well, it is important that we have all forms of energy, but nuclear in particular because it provides such an important baseload component to our electric grid here in the United States. And until we have the battery technologies that we're all working on, then there's no physical possible way for us to move to a 100% renewable world if that's what some are pursuing. We can't do it today without baseload electricity, and nuclear energy is just such an important component of that.
Great. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it and look forward to continuing these discussions. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Merrigan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us. My first question is, over 620,000 clean energy workers have lost their jobs since the start of the pandemic, including over 100,000 in California. You were vocal in your testimony about supporting the fossil fuel industry. Can you tell me what you are doing to help the clean energy industry rebound? And if you could try to do that in 60 seconds, I have a number of questions I'm trying to get to, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, ma'am, I'm happy to do that. Yes, I have been very vocal in my support for the energy industry, but all forms of energy. The pandemic has hit all sectors of the U.S. economy. I don't know if it's been an equal distribution, but the pain has been felt all across the United States. And I'm supportive of the programs that you and your leadership in Congress, others in Congress have done in the last 2, perhaps 3 months in passing programs like the CARES Act, other steps that you have taken to stabilize the U.S. economy as we deal with this pandemic. I want to ensure
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. If I could just interrupt you, I am trying to get to the questions. Is there anything specifically you can tell me about what you are going to do to help the clean energy industry rebound? Anything specifically you might be able to mention?
Well, I think, under the energy efficiency program at the Department of Energy, we're going to continue to invest through our funding opportunity processes. We've released, I think in the last 2 or 3 months, we've announced that we have about $220 million in funding opportunities that are coming exclusively out of the clean energy space in our energy efficiency programs. We're going to continue to make those available to the private sector and make those available so that they can move forward with some of the newer technologies that they want to bring to market. And hopefully that will add some economic assistance to their businesses as well.
Okay, thank you, sir. It was reported in April that your agency is holding back $43 billion of loan guarantees earmarked by Congress for clean energy projects. Why withhold support for the clean energy projects?
Well, I would disagree slightly with the characterization. It's the loan program that's available within the Department of Energy, but it's not available exclusively to clean energy. So we're not withholding that money from the clean energy industry. What I've done is undertake a review of the loan program because coming from the banking industry, I was a little concerned about some of the requirements that were being put in place that might prevent loans from being made. That review is still in process, and I hope to complete it very, very shortly. And at some point in the future, we'll move forward with this lending program.
Well, I hope you will work as quickly for the clean energy projects and sector as you have been for the fossil fuel industry, sir. I happen to represent a district that is almost 90% Latino African American that are surrounded by 3 freeways, the port, and urban oil drilling. Mr. Secretary, what does environmental injustice or environmental justice mean to you?
It means the availability of energy to all sectors of our nation and all communities in our nation. My commitment to environmental justice is very broad. We talked a lot today about energy efficiency and making energy cheaper. I think that's very important for us to do. That is part of this program. And it's my commitment to you, it's my commitment to this Congress to pursue those types of technologies that allow the distribution of energy very, very efficiently in America and, importantly, very cheaply in America.
Well, sir, much like your predecessor when asked this question, you were talking about consumer pricing. But let me just tell you, environmental injustice, and environmental injustice is when there is a disproportionate impact to our communities of color, our Black and Brown communities that are suffering at much higher rates, air pollution. And so when you talk about rolling back air standards, when you talk about making it easier for the fossil fuel industry, you're talking about harming the health of our communities of color. And then COVID hits, and guess what? They're dying at higher rates because they have higher asthma and they're more exposed to this air pollution. And so it's very challenging. If you haven't noticed, there are protesters all across this country right now demanding justice, and that includes environmental justice. And so I would ask you to take a very serious look at efforts that you can take to help fix this huge problem that we have. Do you believe in environmental racism?
Well, I understand your concern, and I think we happen to agree on the need for cleaner technologies going into the marketplace. But I would add that, what's important is that we not only have the development of the technology so that we
Mr. Secretary, the question was whether you believe in environmental racism.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Do you, yes or no?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, it's a term to describe environmental injustices that occur across our country to certain communities, including Black and Brown communities that are disproportionately impacted.
I believe that there are communities that are perhaps disproportionately impacted. I just don't understand what you mean by the term environmental racism.
Okay, well, I could certainly follow up with you, and we should have this conversation because it goes hand in hand about what's happening across this country and where our communities of color are disproportionately impacted. And sir, I know my time has expired, but I will welcome the conversation. And with that, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. And thank you. It's very apparent that you've reached out, like the administration does. You've reached out to talk to us, members of this committee and subcommittee, and on both sides of the aisle. And I appreciate that openness to hear our concerns, our ideas, and get to know us a little better as well. Yeah, well, I appreciate the fact that you'll be coming to Michigan later this week also. And on the glide path in the airport, most likely you'll look down and see my district, and you'll see why it's the energy district of the state with nuclear, with coal, one of the most up-to-date modern coal plants that's still allowed to function, as well as natural gas and manufacturing of wind energy as well in my district. So we're delighted to have you there. Plus, unlike some of my Texas colleagues, you're not going to find 100-degree weather. In fact, when I left the airport today, it was 70 degrees, very low humidity, blue skies, and pure Michigan. And we look forward to sharing that with you. 4 years ago, FERC held a technical conference to discuss a needed modernization of rules relative to PURPA, a law that's a 1978 law that had very strong positive results in moving us toward renewable energy, and do it in such a way that right now it's worked so well that all energy providers have moved into that realm. But it's also, in its present format, causing unnecessary billions of dollars to be paid by consumers because of the outdated law. And so, as you know, I've been heavily involved for years now in trying to reform that. And I'm pleased that FERC had undertaken 4 years ago an attempt to modernize it and is currently preparing to adopt critical components of reform included in legislation that I've championed over the past several Congresses. Due to COVID-19, utilities in my home state of Michigan have reported an increase in residential usage due to more people staying at home. Mr. Secretary, in your opinion, what impacts would reforms to PURPA, such as waiving the mandatory purchase obligations for qualified facilities, have on lowering utility costs for consumers at a time when domestic demand for electricity increased in this new stay-at-home economy?
That's a great question. Probably requires a more thoughtful answer than I'm going to be able to provide you in 30 seconds. But look, I think generally, sir, PURPA needs to be reformed. It was written many, many years ago, I think 1978 or so to be exact, give or take a few years from there, but I think it's 1978. And much has changed, since then. We talked about technology today quite a bit, but the markets themselves have changed. I mean, back in that point in time, utilities were vertically integrated. Today, they're not. We have very competitive markets. And I think it's, appropriate for Congress, for FERC, for others to go back and take a look at this law and see if it still meets the needs of the American people. I might suggest that there are some changes that are long overdue with regard to PURPA. So I would support a review of the law.
We appreciate that, and I'm glad to see what is being done with FERC. I do believe that ultimately we need to do it legislatively so it's permanent, but it has some flexibility in it, unlike the 1978 law.
Sure.
The Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, CSER, leads the Department of Energy's emergency preparedness and coordinated response to disruptions to the energy sector, including physical and cyber attacks, natural disasters, and man-made events. Two questions. The first is, can you please describe the role of the CSER office over the last few months as it relates to the COVID-19 outbreak? And secondly, Mr. Rush and I, Chairman Rush and I, have introduced the Energy Emergency Leadership Act, which would help ensure the durability of DOE leadership in energy emergencies. As the House considers future measures in response to COVID-19 outbreak, would DOE be better positioned to carry out these functions in the long term if the Assistant Secretary of CSER were made permanent in the DOE Organization Act and had clear authority through congressional authorization?
To answer your last question, I think I would answer that question yes, and I want to say thank you to both you and Chairman Rush for your support of that particular office. It's been absolutely essential. And as we saw in this particular pandemic, it's become increasingly important, not only for purposes of its role with regard to cybersecurity, but its role with regard to the catastrophic response efforts. It was the CSER office that provided the mask and provided the testing kits and delivered those to the utilities. It was the CSER office that worked closely with the CEOs of the utilities all across the country to ensure that the control room personnel in particular were quarantined and had done the proper social distancing so that we didn't lose them at some point in this pandemic. Very critical role within the department. I think a very critical role within the industry itself. And I think if you mention this to other utility CEOs, you'll find the similar response.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Peters from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Secretary for being with us today. During this administration, sir, there's been a shift in what to do with nuclear waste. Can you tell us what you think is the appropriate path forward on spent nuclear fuel storage? Right next to my district is the San Onofre facility, which is now closed, for better or worse, and leaving it on the coast near a military base and near that population just doesn't make any sense.
Sure, yes, sir, I'm happy to address that. We feel very strongly in the administration that we have to address the issue of spent nuclear fuel that's currently being stored at all of these utilities all across the country. You mentioned San Onofre. That's a familiar site for me and a familiar topic of conversation for me inside of the DOE. It's important that we address this, but it's also very clear that Congress has chosen not to fund any activity related to what was designated as the final repository in Nevada many years ago. And as a result of that, we are prohibited from moving forward with that particular repository, and we won't move forward with that repository until Congress decides that it will, it may want to do that. In the interim, however, we will focus on some measures that we might take to provide interim relief from the private storage or the storage that currently exists today. We've just begun that process. It will be open, it will be inclusive. I want to work not only with the policymakers here in Congress, but also with the governors and the local officials as well, so that together we might find an appropriate solution. But for the moment, we are frozen by the Congress and the lack of funding for anything related to the final repository.
Would you recommend to Congress that we and request as part of your budget request that we do fund the next steps in processing for finalizing the permitting of Yucca Mountain?
Okay, now it's on. I think what we have proposed is a request for funding that might lead us to develop some of these interim options. With regard to licensing, I'll have to go back and look at the budget request and see what the specifics were, and I'd be happy to respond to you in writing with that answer.
You take a legitimate shot at Congress, and I was in the last Congress, we had actually passed a bill that would have moved Yucca ahead, and that has been not the case in this Congress. But at the same time, we've heard mixed signals from the administration itself, and so if you want to get back on board with Yucca, I'd appreciate knowing that directly. Question about transmission of renewable energy. One of the things I've heard, and I want to see what your opinion is on this, is that one of the obstacles in getting renewable energy from wind farms in places like Texas and from solar farms in places like Arizona is that interstate transmission is difficult to build. Is that your sense? And what is it that Congress could do, if that is your sense, to make transmission of those resources easier to places like Chicago and Detroit where people might need that renewable energy?
It is my sense. We've talked about grid modernization for some years, and we've begun some important work to doing that. The example that you point out, I think, is absolutely on point. We're developing generation sources all across the country, but we lack the ability to move the power from point A to point B. And, much of our electricity grid is, it's many years old, and it's time that we upgrade these facilities. We have to make them smart. We have to get them permitted. Importantly, I think for the transmission of electricity, we need to look at these large infrastructure projects that would allow us to do exactly that. It's akin to what we discussed in the other area. America is now the world's largest producer of energy in terms of oil and gas, and our challenge today is not the production. Our challenge in many cases is actually getting the product to the marketplace, and the same thing exists with electricity.
Does the administration support particular reforms for permitting interstate transmission lines that would serve those northern cities, say with renewable sources from out of state? And if so, what particular reforms would you support?
I would really like to get back to you with a more thoughtful answer, because I think there's some things that we can work together on to make this a little easier. For the development of this type of infrastructure. So rather than perhaps giving you a imprecise or a less than thoughtful answer, I would appreciate the opportunity to perhaps respond to you in writing.
I'll look forward to that, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Thank you very much to the Secretary for coming, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. O'Halloran for 5 minutes. Mr. O'Halloran, please mute your phone. Unmute, rather.
So he's still having technical difficulties with the microphone. Perhaps we could go to Ms. Blunt Rochester while we resolve that.
Mr. O'Halloran is experiencing some technical difficulties. Let us move on. Ms. Blunt Rochester, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Secretary Brouillette, for joining us today. One of the many things that COVID-19 pandemic has taught us is the importance of preparation. And as we start to rebuild our economy from this ongoing public health pandemic, we must be intentional about how we rebuild. That means rebuilding an economy powered by clean energy so that we can have safer and healthier communities. And it also means working together to be better prepared for future public health emergencies. Last month, I introduced the Open Back Better Act. This legislation will ensure that our nation's critical infrastructure, like hospitals and schools, is more resilient, more energy efficient, safer, and more reliable to guard against future threats, and while creating good jobs and prioritizing the communities hit hardest by this pandemic. During a national emergency like a pandemic, with the additional risks from wildlife, hurricanes, and other climate-related disasters, we need more resilient infrastructure. These upgrades are especially important in communities that have been overburdened by the impact of pollution, public health emergencies, and natural disasters. This is why my legislation prioritizes funding for environmental justice communities who have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and which we talked about earlier with Ms. Barragon's testimony. As we emerge from this health and economic crisis, we must do better, and we must ensure that we are better prepared for the inevitable future emergencies. Mr. Secretary, can you discuss why resiliency upgrades to mission critical facilities such as our hospitals is so important during a pandemic?
Yes, ma'am, I can. You know, as we have seen with this pandemic, and candidly, as we've seen in other parts of American history, our reliance upon the electric grid has just increased exponentially over the course of the last few decades. Almost everything that we do depends in some way, shape, or form on the provision of energy and electricity in particular. So as we looked at the pandemic, we obviously were concerned about the hospitals and the provision of healthcare throughout America. But as now we've gotten beyond at least some of the initial moments of the pandemic, and we start to look at how the economy is going to change, we're looking at things like teleworking. And I don't have to remind anybody in this hearing, because we're doing it today. You can't telework without Wi-Fi. You don't have Wi-Fi without electricity. So the importance of the grid to our daily life has only been heightened by this pandemic, and we all see it. So it's important that we think about things like resiliency and reliability in perhaps a different way than we have in years past. We have created at the Department of Energy a resiliency or a resiliency model, which is going to allow us, when fully developed, and we're very close to bringing this out, we can see the entire grid in real time and address challenges that we may face in almost every part of the country. So be it a cyber threat or be it a load threat, we work closely with the utilities, and we can see these things in real time and address them in real time. And in certain cases, as we further develop the model, we may be able to predict where we will have load challenges or particular threats that we need to address so that we can ensure the safe, reliable provision of electricity.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for that answer. And you've kind of preempted one of my questions. And we have many more that we will send to you in writing. But as you were talking, I'm very focused on the future of work. And as you said, whether it's distance learning, telework, or telemedicine, telehealth, we have seen an increase in the need. And I'm curious, during the pandemic, I've been talking to companies about what has changed in the way that they operate. Can you talk about what has changed in the way your department approaches working with other federal and state partners to ensure the continued reliability of the U.S. electric system?
Sure. I don't know that the workforce has changed quite dramatically. So, we're in a maximum telework environment now, and I don't have an exact number for you, but I'd be happy to provide you an update. But if I had to guess today, I would probably suggest that perhaps 60% of the workforce at DOE is now teleworking. There are certain job functions at the department, the delivery of a nuclear warhead to the United States Navy or the U.S. Air Force. You simply can't do that over the telephone. You have to physically deliver it. So we're taking the precautions.
Are you working differently with other agencies, though? Has anything changed, or have you noticed anything?
Not so much in that sense. We're still very, very interactive. Our teleworking capabilities, we have learned that our networks, our IT networks are very robust. We've adopted to the new workplace much like the rest of America has.
Well, I've run out of time, but I will follow up with you to ask how does the upcoming hurricane season impact electric systems reliability during the health crisis? And thank you so much for your testimony. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. O'Halloran, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Are you there, Mr. O'Halloran? Your audio is not working. Please unmute. Mr. O'Halloran, while you're working on your audio, the chair will recognize.
Mr. Shimkus just popped up. Sorry, he just popped up.
The chair will recognize. Mr. O'Halloran, are you there?
He's available.
The chair now recognizes 2 individuals who have waved on to the committee for the purposes of questioning the witness. And the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dan, great to have you here. One of my last times to harass Secretary of Energy, and I had to wave on. I feel like a freshman. I had to wait like 2 hours. So, but it's an important issue, and the issues. I had to drop off, talk with the corn growers on fuels, and those questions have been asked by Dave Lobsek. So you also know that a lot of my career has been spent on nuclear fuel and nuclear waste. And I want to talk about, start with the closing of the fuel cycle. And the current federal law is that the federal government should take title to the spent nuclear fuel and the defense waste. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act passed in 82 and 87 identified that was our responsibility. Is that correct?
It is, yes, sir.
And would you also agree that it's the international scientific consensus that long-term geological repository for high-level nuclear waste and defense waste is the international scientific consensus?
I would agree with that. I think there's a general consensus in the scientific community that that's the best long-term way to dispose of the spent fuel.
Yeah, Britain is looking at it, France is looking at it, Sweden's looking at it, Finland's looking at it. So you know where I'm going. It's no surprise that we have the law of the land for failure of the appropriators to spend the money. Our spent fuel should be going, and our defense waste should be going to Yucca Mountain in Nevada, which has been done the research, the due diligence, and has passed the scrutiny of science. So we will continue to drive those issues, hopefully in other venues. Let me go to the other really important issue, which is the beginning of the fuel cycle. In the beginning of the fuel cycle, when we're reprocessing, how many plants do we have that reprocess to help create nuclear fuel in this country?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear. How many plants do we have that reprocess?
Yeah, or that do the yellow cake into the process of like we see at Metropolis.
That do the conversion processes?
Right.
To my knowledge, I think we only have one. But I will double check that.
And that one, we believe, is in Metropolis. And is that operating right now?
They are in a standby mode, as I understand. They're not fully operational. is my understanding.
So we appreciate this nuclear energy working group and which addressed the domestic uranium reserve, which we talked about offline, and I appreciate that. And as I raised to you in our call, there is a gap of where that may help the reprocessing in the future, since there is a shutdown now. The concern is that we're not going to have a facility to deal with this front end, even with this domestic uranium reserve. Can you talk about some options that might be on the table to help places like Honeywell in Metropolis, Illinois?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. You know, as we pointed out in the Nuclear Fuels Working Group, it's not enough for us just to simply create a uranium reserve. It's not enough for us to pull it out of the ground and stack it up someplace and have it available for some future use. You must convert it, you must enrich it, you must have it available as fuel for it to have any practical value. And that's our intent with the working group. That's our intent. That's why we requested $150 million in the President's budget to establish this reserve. We fully respect the right of Congress to disagree with that, but we think it's important for us to do as a nation. With regard to that one facility that you mentioned earlier, we think it's important for us to maintain that type of capability here in the United States. And it's my commitment to you, it's our department's commitment to you to be focused on that over the course of the next few days and weeks, because I understand the critical economic condition in which that particular facility is in. And I look forward to working with you to see what we might do in terms of finding options or solutions to maintain this important capability here in the United States.
Thank you very much, Chairman. My time's expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. O'Halloran. Are you there, Mr. O'Halloran? The chair now recognizes the final member today, who's also waved on. Mr. Burgess, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for letting me wave on. I was actually a member of this subcommittee for over a decade, but when I was called to duty on the Rules Committee, I had to give up one of my subcommittees, and unfortunately Energy was that subcommittee, but happy to be with you, Mr. Secretary. So as we're looked upon by your Billy Tozan's portrait up on the wall, it's significant that you're here today. Fascinating discussion hearing you talk about getting energy from where it's created to where it's needed. Your predecessor, Secretary Perry, when he was my governor, the longest serving governor in Texas history, by the way, created these competitive energy renewal zones as a state program, but bringing wind energy from West Texas to the population centers in the eastern part of the state. And of course, those cross the district that I represent. And just like, as you might imagine, a pipeline or a highway, bringing those high tension electrical wires across your district from west to east can create a great deal of attention. So it's not just the pipelines, it's not just other areas, but we're, being in favor of wind energy means you also need to be in favor of the infrastructure that is the deliverable to get it to where it is needed. And again, your predecessor was, when he was governor of Texas, was certainly very involved in that. On the issue of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and you and I have had an opportunity to talk about this, and can you speak to where we are with the modernization of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and what it, as you see its future utility might be in over and above what its national security implications have been in the past?
I'd be happy to, Mr. Burgess, and thank you for your service to Texas. It means a lot to all of us who live there, even as an adopted son of Texas. I really appreciate your service to the state and to the country. You know, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a national asset. And as you well know, because of your long history here on this committee and in Texas, it's important to our national security. What we need to do with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, in my view, is to continue the life extension program that was started some time ago. The facility has become quite old. It's important that we continue to maintain it in a way that allows it to continue to be helpful to the nation. I would also suggest that the Congress might want to consider perhaps upgrading some of the facility as well. When it was designed to take in oil. It wasn't designed to discharge oil. Not very effective, or I'm sorry, I had that backwards. It was designed to take it out, not put it in. And it's very important that we think about, whether or not we'd like to upgrade the facility so that it would allow us to take in oil even more efficiently than we can currently do so today. As you know, the president directed me to fill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and we've been doing exactly that. We are somewhat limited by the amount and the volume of oil that we can actually take into the facility itself. So as we move forward, I'd love to work with this committee, I'd love to work with Congress more broadly to think about how we might upgrade that important facility.
Well, certainly my opinion was an oversight to leave the purchase of additional petroleum for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve out of the CARES Act, and I do have a bill with Senator Dorgan designed to do just that, and I do want to work with you on that. Can I just ask you a question, since I am also on the Rules Committee? We're going to be hearing about the National Defense Authorization Act in the Rules Committee at the end of this week, and the whole issue of the authority, taking the authority from the Department of Energy to some other location for the America's nuclear weapons. Historically, you've maintained and had the authority over the nation's nuclear capability. What can you speak to why civilian control of the nuclear arsenal is so important?
I think, I don't know that I can give you all of the details around it, but it's a long-standing military, it's a long-standing tenet in our national security apparatus here in the United States. It's one of the reasons I think, especially when you're talking about nuclear warheads. I mean, we're not talking about sidearms, we're not talking about, 9mm rounds, we're talking about weapons of mass destruction. These are very large warheads. From its very creation, the Atomic Energy Commission was created as a civilian agency because it was civilian scientists who helped develop the technology. It has been those scientists and their successors who have maintained that capability here in the United States. It's always been in the Department of Energy. It's always been in the scientific realm, and that's why we've developed these national laboratories. It's also why we've developed the supercomputing capabilities that allow us to simulate things like testing today. The United States stopped testing its warheads in 1992. As these warheads now age, it's very, very important that we monitor that aging process and we ensure the safety and effectiveness of the stockpile. To do that, we rely upon the national laboratories that are all part of the DOE network and all part of the DOE enterprise. And that's why if Congress is considering a change, I would urge it to leave it within the Department of Energy so that the NNSA can continue to rely upon these national assets.
I'll just commit to you, and anything in the future this committee can do to ensure that the National Nuclear Security Agency stays within the Department of Energy, I think is critically important. And I'll make that commitment to you as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentlemen, you're back. We have some unanimous consent requests that I want to itemize here and request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from former Secretaries Perry and Moniz to the Armed Services Committee, a letter from the Secretary of Energy to Chairman Inhofe, a letter from Chairman Pallone and Ranking Member Walden to the Armed Services Committees, a letter from Norm Augustine and Richard Mears to NDAA, to the NDAA conferees, a letter from former DOE secretaries to the NDAA conferees, a letter from Ranking Member Upton and former Chairman Waxman to the Armed Services Committees, February 2016 memorandum from the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, and finally, May 2020 op-ed by Secretary Brouillette. And hearing no objection, the unanimous consent request is approved. This concludes the witness questioning portion of our hearing, and I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your participation in today's hearing. It's been a lengthy hearing, but it's been an excellent hearing, and we thank you for your excellent testimony. I do remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the Secretary who has appeared before this committee, the subcommittee. I ask the Secretary to respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. And at this time, the subcommittee is hereby adjourned.
Yes, sir. I hope you can join us at our guide. It'll be fun.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Good to see you again.
See you.
Thank you, guys.
Sorry if I inadvertently cut you off, Mr. Secretary.
All right, sir. Travel safely.
Adios. Thank you all. Yep. Sounds good.